Welcome back to another episode of Revealed Apologetics. I'm your host, Eli Ayala, and I want to apologize. I am out of breath. I was running up the stairs. I was going to go live at 9. Again, this is another unplanned live stream. I was going to go live at 9, and then I had, creating the video and all that kind of stuff. I was running out of time, so I pushed it to 9:10. I ran, grabbed myself a cup of water, and running all the way up the stairs. I don't know my volume here. Running up all the way up the stairs, I am out of breath. So, but here I am. I am super happy. It is Friday. As you guys know, I am a teacher during the week. Let me see here. I'm a teacher during the week. And I have a pretty packed schedule. And so I really enjoy Fridays. And so I was like, you know what? I didn't have time to formally plan something, but why don't I just do something tonight? I had the time. And so here I am. Okay. Having some microphone issues here though. But I am let me see here. If I turn my volume up, it like by itself turns down. Hopefully I won't touch anything. So if you watched my last video, I responded to an argument that an atheist put out against my my assertion and my argument. Offered an argument that unbelievers know God, they have a knowledge of God, yet they suppress the truth and unrighteousness. I gave, I made the argument that unbelievers are self-deceived, and I talked about the nature of self-deception, and the difference between first-order beliefs and second-order beliefs, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to revisit that here, but went over that and responded to an argument along the following lines. The atheist kind of put it in a deductive form. He said something along the lines that if God exists, I know he exists, because that's my claim, right? The Christian God asserts in Revelation that all men have a knowledge of God. He says, if God exists, I know that he exists. I don't know that he exists, therefore he doesn't exist. And so I interacted with that and showed why that argument doesn't work. You guys can check out that video. But I think I unlocked a special code. Okay, a special code that when it is unlocked, the internet atheists, storm the comments. I think that's probably, out of all my videos, it's got the most comments from atheists and skeptics and things like that. And let's just say, all of the comments, well, I can't say all, that's not fair. Most of the comments evince a complete ignorance of presuppositionalism, transcendental argumentation, burden of proof, and worldviews. And so they were so bad. Now, obviously, I can't interact with every comment, of course, but they were so bad. I've collected a bunch of them, and I'll have a friend on with me. We'll have some fun and we'll interact with them. But they're really bad. And, unfortunately, people can't think clearly. In the questions that people ask, they ask me questions that I directly address specifically and on purpose went slow to go through. And then people bring up points as though, they're nifty in bringing those points up as though I did not address the specific thing in the video. So apparently when I say, here's what I'm saying, here's not what I'm not saying, this thing. And then in the comments, so you're saying, and then they'll say, this is what you're saying. No, I just told you that's not what I'm saying. So when you tell people that's not what I'm saying, they still think that's what you're saying. And so I can't do anything about that. Right. So I'm going to speak to the folks who are interested in thinking and following. And by the way, this is the case even if you disagree with me. If you disagree with me, you still have the capacity to at least understand what I'm saying. But of course, that's not true of everyone else, unfortunately. So nevertheless, no, Alyssa Scott, it's not Matt Slick. I have a friend that I guess you'll have to wait and see. He'll come on with me and we'll have a fun time interacting with the comments and the questions and things like that. It'll provide me an opportunity to expand on some things and hopefully inform people who actually care about listening. So again, so there you go. I hope that is useful for folks when we do that. Now, I am very excited about this specific episode because we are going to be talking about something that I think is really important. My microphone is like really spazzing out here. We're going to be talking about something really, really important that is going to be useful in helping the apologist expose the foundations of a worldview and the implications of that specific foundation. Okay, I'm going to tell you what I mean. Okay, what I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, well, give me 1 second here. I'm getting like a weird situation here. Let me see. If I turn this up, it like, let's see here. All right. If I turn it up, it like turns my volume down. Interesting. Okay. Anyway, what we're going to be talking about today is something called open and closed systems within worldviews. Okay. Now, I'm going to explain what this means. But Cornelius Van Til, in his works, he discussed this issue of open and closed worldview systems. And when you understand what an open and closed system is with respect to worldviews, it's actually very helpful in understanding where someone else is coming from and some of the implications of a worldview that is either open or closed. And we'll talk about what that means. Okay. Now let's kind of start with this idea. Okay. And give me a thumbs up if you're watching and you hear me okay. I'm coming in okay. The sound quality is good because really my headphones or my microphone's really spazzing out today. There we go. Okay. So let me unpack this idea of open and closed systems. Okay. Van Til, again, emphasized open and closed systems in his writings for a very, very important reason. Okay. And understanding this distinction, I think, is going to really help us see how different worldviews either provide what we call a stable foundation for truth and knowledge, or whether they undermine those things altogether. Okay. Now, folks are saying it sounds good. Okay. Well, what might be distracting is maybe my headphones. I don't want to unplug anything. So yeah, I'm just going to assume you guys hear me okay. 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 So then after I go over kind of the basics of open and closed systems, then we're going to explore the practical implications of recognizing whether a worldview operates on an open or closed system. Okay. And being aware of whether a worldview is operating on an open or closed system is going to be useful when engaging with other worldviews, especially when you're talking with atheists. Okay. And so I think this is going to be very, very helpful. All right. Jeremiah Nortier, sorry, I will text you back, my good friend, so we can do something together. That's my bad. Things have been busy. It's our first full week of school back from the summer break, so things have been a little hectic, and even this live stream here is kind of the last second. So I haven't forgot you, bruh. All right. We will make it happen. But anyway, let me jump in by defining my terms. Okay. Open and closed systems. I promise you, if you like apologetics and you're interested in like, how do I get to the foundation of a worldview and pull out some of the implications of a worldview, this is going to be very helpful. Okay. So let's begin with a closed system. Okay. I'm going to go slowly so that folks can follow. Okay. So a closed system, okay, refers to a worldview that has definitive boundaries and is governed by a consistent set of principles. And so in this context, something like the Christian worldview would be considered a closed system, okay, specifically because it is grounded in the revelation of God, who's clearly defined the nature of reality, truth, morality, and so forth. And within this framework of the Christian worldview, this is key. Not everything is possible, okay? Within the Christian worldview, there are limits and order because everything is subject to God's sovereign design. Okay. So not everything is possible. There are certain things that God governs the world in a certain way. God is not arbitrary. He doesn't do contradictions. There are limits. Okay. Within a closed system, specifically the Christian worldview closed system, the ultimate foundation of reality is rational, and there are boundaries. Okay. And God sets those boundaries as it reflects his nature and so forth. Now, when you think of in terms of what we call an open system with respect to a worldview is characterized by a lack of ultimate boundaries or fixed principles. Okay. For example, an open worldview would be one whose ultimate foundation is rooted in contingency and chance, okay, and randomness. Okay, there is no ultimate rationality to the world because it just is. Everything that in the world is birthed from a foundation of random chance. Okay, that is an open system. As a matter of fact, within science, you often work within an open system because that assumes categories of neutrality, right? You can't assume beforehand with respect to how many people do science, especially understanding, for example, the scientific method as it has been understood classically from the Enlightenment period. Anything is possible, okay? And you do your experiments, things like this, and then you identify regularities, and then you establish those regularities as laws and so forth. But an open system, okay, at its foundation, is characterized by a lack of ultimate boundaries or fixed principles. Okay, many atheistic worldviews fall into this category of open systems. Okay, because without belief in a sovereign God, there is no overarching design or purpose governing the universe. And so, in an open system, everything, hypothetically speaking, is theoretically possible because nothing is ultimately determined or fixed, okay, at that fundamental worldview level. Now, there are some atheists who might posit a closed system as opposed to an open system. We'll talk about that, okay? And so this lack of definitive boundaries really leads to a chaotic understanding of reality where truth, logic, morality are not grounded in any ultimate source, okay? And as a result, knowledge becomes uncertain. Rational discourse can break down very quickly, as you know, in an atheistic worldview where everything is sound and fury signifying nothing, right? You don't have ultimate stability. That's why atheists, and they might not like this, but I'm just going to say it anyway, because I'm quite confident based on my interactions and my reading and study, atheists cannot account for the universal absolute laws of logic. Atheists cannot account for objective, unchanging principles of morality. Atheists cannot account for the uniformity of nature, the very things that are assumed when science is being used and when people are using the methods of science. Why? They can't account for it because their worldview doesn't have a foundation that is fixed. Okay, it is an open system. Now, if you hold to a closed system, we'll address that. But so that's the difference between an open system and a closed system. Something like Christianity or some other theistic perspectives like Islam or something along those lines will have what we call a closed system. Okay, so you have, at least within the worldview, some foundation where there are standards, there are limits in some way, shape, or form. But a worldview in which all reality is birthed from the womb of ultimate randomness and chance, theoretically, within that perspective, anything really is possible. Okay, so nevertheless, now when engaging in apologetics with atheists specifically, I think understanding this this distinction, I think, is critical. Okay, the Christian can point out that the closed system of the Christian worldview, okay, provides the preconditions for rational thought, moral absolutes, a true knowledge of reality because of revelation and so forth. But in the open system of atheism, or at least some flavors of atheism, okay, that system, by denying fixed, ultimate absolute standard, denying a sovereign source of truth, like something in Christianity, it's ultimately going to undermine its own claims to knowledge and rationality. Okay, by highlighting the instability and inconsistency within an open system, the apologist can demonstrate that only a closed system like the Christian worldview can adequately account for the realities of human experience and the coherency of truth. And so this approach not only defends the truth of Christianity, but it also exposes the weakness of any system that is predicated upon a foundation of ultimate randomness. Okay, when you're thinking in terms of the ultimate foundation of a worldview, is everything birthed from a foundation of chance, or is there a closed system in terms of which there are boundaries? Okay, now if someone says, well, I'm an atheist and I hold to a worldview that not everything is open. Okay, you have different people, right? People have different perspectives. Okay, that they might hold to the idea that there are certain boundaries within understanding of reality and so forth, and that limits what's possible, right? They're making here an important claim when someone makes that assertion. So if someone's an atheist to say, I don't hold to an open system, I hold to a closed system, right? This is going to raise some questions though. Okay, in a worldview where there is no God to reveal the true nature of reality, here's the question: how can the atheist be in a position to know whether the perspective they are asserting is actually an example of a closed system or an open system, right? Without God as the ultimate source of truth and revelation, finite beings are left without any sure way to determine whether their understanding of reality is grounded in an open or closed system. Okay. They're in an epistemological problem. Okay. So if you have a closed system that is theistically grounded, okay, we have a God who reveals the nature of reality, and we could know that the system in which we're operating in is a closed system. Okay. Now, if you are in an open system, okay, you don't have those foundations. Anything is hypothetically possible. If you don't believe in a sovereign God who reveals, but you assert a closed system, from a finite perspective, there's no way for you to know whether the system in which you're operating is open or closed. Okay. And so that has epistemological issues that are going to be connected. Okay. All right. Now, the faithist atheist. Okay. Thank you so much for your comments. I appreciate it. He says some things we know because they work. Now, an appeal to pragmatism is not going to help. They're repeatable and transferable. Okay. Now, the repeatability of something and the projection into the future of what the future most likely will be, you run into the problem that David Hume pointed out, which is the problem of the uniform of induction. Okay. Why, or rather, how can you know that the future will be like the past? Once you appeal to the repeatable examples of the past, you're not answering the question of how you know that will be the case in the future. Okay. This is classic David Hume. What you need to connect past regularities to future prediction of regularity is something that itself is not empirically observed. So if you hold to it, it's not an empirical object. You don't know it on empirical grounds. You are assuming a principle of uniformity. But if God does not exist, all is sound and fury signifying nothing. What justifies that assumption? The justification cannot be the past successes of the repeatability, for that is simply to beg the question. Okay. Again, this is classic David Hume. This isn't presuppositional Eli saying this. I don't think, and I'm sure there are atheists out there, somewhat sophisticated and are familiar with the literature that might put forth an answer. But me personally, right now, as I stand from where I'm speaking from, I do not think an atheistic philosophical perspective has an answer to Hume. And if the answer is, well, things have always worked that way in the past, and we have a pragmatic, we approach it from a pragmatic aspect. Maybe I'll do a video where I critique pragmatism. That might be a good topic there. But thank you, faithist atheist. I appreciate your comments there. I don't want to get too much into this because I've actually covered this in more depth in another video, but I appreciate that. Okay, now. So what I was saying before is, without the certainty provided by divine revelation, I'm going to argue that an atheist is left to speculate on the nature of reality based on limited human knowledge, right? Which can never fully grasp the ultimate nature of existence from within an atheistic perspective, okay? And so this uncertainty, I would argue, undermines any claim to a truly closed system, as it's going to rely on assumptions that can't be verified without an infinite source of knowledge. You see, so if the atheist asserts, well, I don't have the problem of an open system because I assert a closed system. Okay, well, to assert a closed system and is to make a metaphysical assertion that on atheistic grounds cannot be known epistemologically, because there's no way for the atheist without revelation to know the fundamental foundational nature of reality and know that it's in fact a closed system. Okay, now, if the atheist denies a closed system altogether and instead affirms an open system, right, they're going to be left with a framework that undermines rationality itself. In an open system where everything's contingent and nothing is ultimately fixed, the very foundations of logic, morality, knowledge become unstable. And so there are no absolutes on that perspective, and therefore no consistent basis for reasoning or understanding the world. Okay, so in essence, okay, by rejecting a closed system grounded in divine revelation, I would argue that the atheist is left with a worldview that can't reliably account for the certainty and coherency provided or required, rather, for rational thought. And so this exposes, I think, a fundamental weakness in the atheistic perspective, or any perspective that's rooted in an open system. And I think highlights the necessity of a closed system. And I would argue, I'm not going to argue it here, but I would argue that it's a Christian closed system. It doesn't work in other closed systems like Islam or anything along those lines. Okay. Now, when an atheist operating from within an open system argues with us, for example, this is key. I hope you guys pay attention to this. I think this is helpful. Okay. When an atheist operating from within an open system, as I've defined it here, argues with us about the truth of our perspective, okay, it's crucial to recognize the inherent problem in that approach. Okay. They're arguing from a position where their own worldview lacks a solid foundation for the very points they're trying to make. An open system by its nature does not provide the necessary grounding for certainty, rationality, or absolute truth. Okay, now watch this. When an atheist asks questions like, how do you know this, Mr. Christian? Or how do you know God exists? All while assuming the framework of an open system, there is an intrinsic limitation in their ability to accept any answer. I'm going to say that again. Okay. When the atheist asks the question, how do you know God exists? Or how do you know this? How do you know that? While assuming a framework of an open system, there is an intrinsic limitation in their ability to accept any answer. Think about that. In an open system, everything is uncertain. Everything is fluid. It's without fixed reference points. And this means that no matter how, this is so key. This means that no matter how strong or logical the evidence or argument presented, the atheist can always fall back on an inherent uncertainty of their worldview. They might respond by saying, well, we can't be sure about that. Or there might be some other explanation, right? And this continual skepticism isn't always a rhetorical tactic. Sometimes it is, right? And Christians do that too. It's not always a rhetorical tactic. It's a necessity within an open system that inherently lacks definitive foundations. They're compelled to remain uncertain because their worldview doesn't allow for the kind of certainty and absolute truth that a closed system like the Christian worldview provides. I'm going to say that again, okay? They are compelled to remain uncertain because their worldview doesn't allow for the kind of certainty and absolute truth that a closed system like the Christian worldview provides. Okay. This is why when engaging in apologetics with someone who kind of holds to an open system, whether they know they hold to an open system or not, okay, it can feel kind of like an endless loop, right? No matter how strong your argument or how clear the evidence, right? The open system always provides an escape hatch because it inherently denies the possibility of final authoritative answers on any of these fundamental issues. The very nature of an open system is to keep everything in flux, preventing any claim from being ultimately settled. Okay. Now, I think that is a key point. Okay. So the key point here is that the atheist skepticism isn't necessarily about specific answers we give, necessarily, but it's about the fundamental nature of their worldview being an open system, which precludes the acceptance of any absolute answers, or truth with respect to the ultimate issues of God's existence, knowledge, truth, and so forth. And so they're operating from a position that cannot allow for the certainty that the Christian worldview offers. And this is why their challenges often miss the mark, right? They're questioning the truth from a perspective, okay? They question the truth of our perspective, right? They are questioning the truth from a perspective that by definition denies the possibility of attaining it. I'm going to say that again. They are questioning the truth from a perspective by definition denies the possibility of attaining it. Their own worldview does not allow for truth, yet they will say, how do you know your position is true? And anything you give them, it's not going to work because in an open system, they're always going to have uncertainty. Okay. Now, understanding this dynamic, I think, is critical in apologetics. It reveals that the real issue isn't just about the individual arguments or evidence and so forth, right? But it's about the underlying worldview assumptions, those foundations that either allow for or deny the possibility of certainty and truth. And so without acknowledging this, the atheist critique, their critiques really lack the very foundation necessary to make any meaningful claim against the Christian worldview at all. Okay. So here I am holding to a worldview that's an open system. Anything is possible, right? So everything if everything's possible, right, your answer is never going to be definitive because there's always a possible other answer, okay? Because the system is open, Yet they will ask you for evidence and absolute proof for your position and so forth, and all these sorts of things. But when you give anything, they can't interpret it as such because they have an open system. They always are in constant flux, no foundation whatsoever. Now, you might say, well, if that's true, then how can an atheist ever be saved? Or anyone who holds to an open system, whether it's an atheist or whoever, okay? How can someone ever be saved? And that's where our theology comes in, right? They won't be saved unless the Spirit of God changes their heart. Okay. And of course, when the Spirit of God works on someone's heart, of course, we are a new creation in Christ Jesus, right? Our worldview changes, our heart changes. We begin to see things as God reveals it. Okay. Let's see here. Let me see who's got here. The Faithiest Atheist, compelled to remain uncertain, might be a good title if I that would be a good title. That does sound like a good title. Let's see here. Kyoto says, do you think the Trinity is revealed in natural revelation or special revelation? Yeah, I think the idea of unity and plurality, and that God is the grounding of unity and plurality, is found in natural revelation and is more specified and given more content in special revelation. Okay. So for example, I think you can find unity and plurality in nature. And even the pre-Socratic philosophers dealt with this a lot. What is the fundamental nature of reality? Is it an ultimate one? Is it an ultimate many? We see all of these different things, but we also need these unifying abstract principles to make sense out of it all. And so I do think that the world reflects the triune maker. And so in that sense, yeah, there are elements of it in natural revelation, but of course, with special revelation and scripture and so forth, there's more detail that's provided. Okay. Hope that answers your question. Good question. Yeah. All right. So let me give you some examples here. Okay. Open, closed system and all these things. Okay. Give some practical examples and give me a thumbs up if you're following along. Like, hey, this is somewhat helpful, man. Thanks a lot. Or, man, I have no idea what you're talking about. Again, I just decided to come on today, so I'm just blabbing. But I hope it's useful. Okay. So let's talk, for example, about the nature of morality. Okay. So, an atheist might argue, how can you say that God is the source of morality, right? Morality is just a social construct that evolves over time. This was actually one of the comments in my video. They were like, of course, morality is subjective because many people have different moral views. Okay. So the fact that people have different moral views doesn't logically follow that therefore morality is subjective. They could be suppressing the truth and unrighteousness, right? That's possible too, right? But nevertheless, okay. They say, how can you say that God is the source of morality, right? Morality is just a social construct. It's evolved over time. We hear stuff like this all the time. Now, I want you to think about this though, okay? In an open system, as I've explained it here, where there is no ultimate source of morality, like God in an open system, right? You don't have God in such an open system, right? The concept of right and wrong becomes subjective and fluid, right? The subjectivity of it all is rooted in the fact that at the worldview foundation, it's an open system, okay? And so if morality is just a social construct, then it changes with the whims of society, okay? What's considered moral today could be deemed immoral tomorrow. And so the atheist operating from an open system has no fixed foundation for asserting any absolute moral truths. And so when they argue against the Christian morality, and they do so from a position that cannot provide a consistent or objective basis for morality itself, okay, any moral critique they offer is undermined by their own worldview, which denies the possibility of fixed moral truths. Okay. So you see how the open system, sorry if my volume sounds, this is really bothering me. So sorry, guys. Let me check my sound stuff next time before I go live. You guys are saying you hear it okay, but it kind of sounds weird in my headset here. But nevertheless, so that's an example. When you have an open system and a worldview that impacts your view of morality, okay? And sometimes if someone is holding to an open system, but they're affirming objective things and absolute truth and universal applicability of logic and so forth, you can show that tension. There's a tension between the open nature of their system and the fixed certainties that they want to assert on the one hand. That is what we call a philosophical tension, within someone's worldview. Just looking at a comment here. Thanks for answering. Would love to ask more questions about that in the future. Perhaps in the future you can do a stream on the Trinity from natural revelation, one in the many. Well, Kyoto, I have many videos already on this channel relating to the one in the many, and they're long, like gone into detail. So maybe type in one in the many revealed apologetics. You'll find a bunch of videos on this channel. So hopefully that will be helpful to you. Okay. Thank you for that. And feel free. I mean, this is kind of, I'm just chilling right now. So if you have a question, I'll try my best to answer. So you can just put them in the chat. Just make sure you preface your question with questions so that I can distinguish it from the other comments and stuff. So, all right, let's continue on here. So we talked about morality. So let's think in terms of the reliability of science. Okay. An atheist might say, okay, an atheist who has an open system. Okay. Again, there may be atheists who say, nope, I have a completely closed system, bro. You know, we've addressed that already. Okay. Now, an atheist might say that science is the only reliable way to know truth. Now, I'm being very general here. Not all atheists say that, although you do have people who, even though they say that's not what they're saying, they sure talk like that, right? Where's the empirical evidence for your God, right? Assuming that only empirical evidence or scientific evidence is the only kind of evidence that's acceptable. Okay. Some people are not aware of their own epistemology. Okay. That's why Van Til talked about the importance of being epistemologically self-conscious. Okay. We need to be aware of our own epistemological theory of knowledge, and we want to make the unbeliever aware of their own. Many people are not aware of their own epistemology, right? They just have kind of this, maybe you're talking to someone with holding to like a naive empiricism, right? You know, it's like, well, if I don't see it, you know, that's it, right? Knowledge comes all through the senses, right? They might not say that, but they sure argue that way. Okay. Now, so if an atheist were to say, just hypothetically, just using this as kind of a quick example, right? So science is the only reliable way to know truth, and it doesn't need God, right? You know, think about that. Okay. Science within the Christian worldview is understood as a reliable method because it's based on what? It's based on the assumption that the universe is orderly, it's consistent, it's governed by the laws established by a rational creator, right? And that's a closed system. There's the boundaries. Okay. Not everything is possible on that view. Okay. There are limitations because there are standards, and those standards issue from God's consistent nature. Okay. Now, in an open system, there's no guarantee that the laws of nature will remain consistent or that the universe operates according to any fixed order. Okay. If everything is a product of random chance, as many atheist perspectives suggest, there's no reason to trust that the scientific method is going to yield consistent, reliable results. Okay. The very foundation of science, the assumption of order and consistency, is something that an open system cannot account for. And so when the atheist argues for the reliability of science from within an open system, they are ironically relying on assumptions that their worldview cannot justify, because open systems do not justify these fixed standards. Okay. They have at their base an open system, but they argue and ask for justifications and make arguments that are using things that only make sense within a closed system. So they have an open system, but they argue and talk like they're coming from a closed system. And if they argue and talk as though they're coming from a closed system and that's their position, they say, I do hold to a closed position. I come from a closed perspective. There are limits to what can happen. From an atheist perspective, without revelation, they're not in a position to know that that's the case because there's no revelation. What could you know from an atheistic perspective, okay, about the ultimate nature of reality? Now, you might doubt that the Christian is right on his perspective, but at least within the Christian worldview, it makes sense to say that we could be in a position to know certain aspects of reality because within our worldview, God's revealed it, okay? So we are consistent when we say things true about the nature of reality and existence, because within our worldview there's revelation, and that's wrapped up in our worldview, our epistemology. We believe that knowledge comes through revelation. Everything is revelatory, okay, from within our worldview. Okay, now when you're taking a look at something like logic, you know, someone might argue, well, logic doesn't depend on God. It's just a human construct we've developed over time. I've heard this read in some of the comments. Is that everyone's view of logic? No, that's not everyone's view of logic, but this is a view that is popular. Okay. All right. Logic doesn't depend on God. It's just a human construct, right? Or it's a language we develop to talk about reality, right? These sorts of things. But again, logic is based on fixed immaterial laws that are universally applicable, okay, such as the law of non-contradiction. And so, by the way, people in an open system often will reject the universal application of the law of non-contradiction, right? Even the law of identity, okay? Now, I'm going to stop here because the Faithist Atheist brought a really great point, okay? And thank you again, Faithist Atheist. I appreciate it. You say this kind of approach kind of sets you up to never have a conversation with atheists. If you say whatever we say falls apart before we say it, then some atheists might think there's no point in having the conversation. Now, it's all about how we communicate, right? I think you and I, Faithist Atheist, can have a really good conversation because we come to the conversation in goodwill. I argue from my perspective, I'm a Christian. I believe that the Christian worldview does, in fact, provide the only basis for the things that I've been talking about. But I understand you, Mr. Faithist Atheist, might disagree with that. Let's talk about it, okay? I could be a jerk about it, and that closes off communication, or we can be respectful, like you are, and have a cup of coffee or something like that, and let's explore these things, okay? If you think that the Christian argument, from my perspective, a presuppositional argument, is fallacious in some way, then I want to treat you as a Christian. I want to treat you as an image bearer of God that's worth respecting and listening to, okay? And then, of course, hopefully you see me as someone that's like, okay, well, he has this really strong position that he really holds to, but he can be reasoned with. I can be reasoned with. Hopefully you think I could be reasoned with. And we might explore whether my argument holds water or not. And that's where we have meaningful discussion. So Faithist Atheist, I really think it's an issue of how we communicate. Okay, I've had conversations. It's very different. The internet world is different than personal interaction. I've had great conversations with atheists and unbelievers about these things. And I will say, with respectfully, from the Christian worldview, I don't think that you can answer these really important worldview questions. And someone said, "Oh, I know, I think I can answer them." Well, let's explore that together. Let's talk about it. I've even said, now, of course, I'm a Christian, right? I believe my position is true. But there are some points that atheists have brought up. I'm like, that's a great point. Now, I'm pretty sure there's an answer to that. I don't know how to answer that right now. Maybe you give me a little time and I can think about it, and maybe we can continue this conversation. So yeah, when you say this kind of approach sets you up to never have conversations, that's not my experience. It really, for me, in my experience, it's how you interact with people. Okay. Now, it's very interesting, as you would imagine, looking at me on YouTube. People have different perceptions, right? I've been called the nicest presuppositionalist out there online. And in the same thread, someone will say I'm the most arrogant person they've ever seen. So I can't control I try my best to be respectful. I'm giving arguments and I'm critiquing not so much people, but like their worldview. But again, you can be interpreted in various ways. And I can't control that, right? There are people who hate my guts. And I haven't done anything to them except express my position and tried my best to give reasons for, give reasons for why I hold the positions that I hold. I want to put this up here, Faithist Atheist, because I appreciate that. He says, I agree with that. How you think of and treat others makes a huge difference. That's right. So let's get your other comment here. You said, this kind of approach kind of sets you up to never have a conversation with atheists. If you say whatever we say falls apart before we say it, then some atheists might think there's no point in having a conversation. Well, think about it. From my perspective, Faithist Atheist, I think the Bible teaches that what you're going to say as an atheist falls apart. So it's not me saying it. It's my position from a biblical perspective. Now, that might close off conversation, definitely, depending on how I present it. But I'm still going to present it as my position, but I want to do it respectfully, right? Knowing that that my words are not the only thing that goes forth from my mouth. Faithist Atheist, I believe that when I share the gospel and I defend the faith, it is also the Spirit of God that goes with me. And it is the Spirit of God that works on the person's heart. Right. So even though someone will say, well, if you said that to me, I could never have a conversation with someone like that. Well, I've had people who said that in one breath and in the next breath, they're like, well, you know what? Yeah, that's something I can think about. And I've had some great conversations with people because I know that you might not hold to this, but I know that the Spirit of God works on people's hearts, and God is very good at softening hearts. So there you go. So yes, I agree with you. It is very important about how we treat others as well. Now I know presuppositionalists online are guilty, often guilty, not everyone obviously, but are often guilty of being very arrogant, not in the argumentation, because the argument's just the argument. We're trying to make an argument. We think it's correct, so on and so forth. But the way we carry ourselves, right? Presuppositionalists often get a bad reputation for coming across a certain way. And I could own up to that, right? Now, I've tried my best not to do those things. Maybe I failed, but I suppose, I do get positive feedback from genuine people like, hey, I really disagree with you, man, but thank you for, trying to be nice. I try, maybe I fail miserably, but, no matter how nice you try to be, there's always going to be someone that's like, you're a jerk, man. So, especially online, that's just how it works. But atheist, I appreciate every time you make a comment. If you lived near me, I would love to have I would love to have a cup of coffee with you. So, all right, let me see here. Let's see. Let's see. Grant says, are there any necessary truths on the view that logic is a social construct derived from empirical experience used to make inductive statements? This seems to be only a popular view. So are there any necessary truths on the view that logic is a social construct derived from empirical experience? Well, I think right there's a problem. You do not derive logical principles empirically because logic is abstract. You don't go out and observe the law of non-contradiction, right? They're abstractions. Okay, we impose logical principles upon what we see, and we draw conclusions, so forth. But that's not you don't derive logical truths empirically. Okay, so I would have a problem with that. Okay, you don't derive logic from empirical experience. Matter of fact, you must think in logical categories to even make sense of your empirical experience, right? So yeah. Okay, let's see here. James, pre-suppers are generally associated with the likes of Darth Dawkins. Yeah, well, I mean, people argue online. They go crazy over arguments, and people could be mean to it, but that's a decision, right? I mean, people need to make the decision to say, hey, I strongly disagree with this person, but I'm going to treat this person respectfully. And again, that's going to be it has been misinterpreted, right? If I say, the atheist can't make sense out of intelligible experience, and people take that as an insult. Well, I'm not attacking the person. I'm attacking the atheistic perspective. I know atheism is not a worldview. Whatever view you want to call it, that has as part of it a denial of God, I would argue, can't make sense out of intelligible experience. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, but that's not an insult to a person. It's really the perspective I'm talking about. But again, there are going to be some people who are going to take that personally, and I can't control that, right? I mean, I can say, I don't mean it for you to take it personally, but then even saying that, there are people who say, dude, you're so condescending. No, I'm not trying to insult you. Oh, now you're tone policing. It's like, well, I can't do anything about that, right? So if I say here, this is not what I'm doing, and then the person's convinced that that's what I'm doing, I can't do anything about that, right? I have no choice, but just, especially since we're not face to face, right? The only thing I can do is just move on. So yeah. All right. Yeah. You live in Phoenix. Oh man. Okay. Yeah. I was in Phoenix not that long ago. Oh man. Well, next time I'm in Phoenix, if I do something with Apologia, I will try to reach out to you in some way, and maybe we can grab a cup of coffee or something. Yeah. I was hanging out with, I think it was Vocab Malone. I think we were in Phoenix. Were we in Phoenix? I think we were in Phoenix. Maybe not. I don't know the areas around there. But I was hanging out with Vocab, and if I ever get myself over there, then we should totally connect. Yeah, absolutely. Let's see here. How does the incomprehensibility of God relate to presuppositionalism? Well, the incomprehensibility of God is a theological position based upon the fact that God cannot be fully comprehended in his entirety. right? So we cannot know God in a comprehensive sense. But in the limited sense that we can know him, we can truly know him. I'll say that again. We cannot fully comprehend every aspect of God, but the aspects that he reveals, we can know those aspects truly as he reveals himself. Okay. So the incomprehensibility of God is basically the idea that he cannot be fully comprehended. Okay. But that doesn't mean he can't be comprehended at all. I don't think that God is so totally other that there's no way for us to know anything about God. As a matter of fact, I've had people say this before, that if God exists, we couldn't know anything about him. He's so transcendent. The problem with that is that it's self-refuting. For if we can't know anything about God, how do you know that about God? Namely, that if God exists, he's the kind of God that can't be known. That's to tell me something about God. So I don't think God is completely incomprehensible, but the doctrine of incomprehensibility is simply the idea that we can't fully understand him in his entirety, in his essence. Okay, good question. Let's see here. All right, so let's talk again about this open and closed system. We spoke about the, did I mention logic? Yeah, I mentioned logic. You get the idea, okay? In an open system, you don't have certainty. So if you're coming from an open system perspective and you're arguing as though you are looking for certainty, that's an inconsistency. So if you are arguing from an open system in which chance and randomness is fundamental, okay, yet you turn around and demand objective evidence and proof, that's an inconsistency, because your open system won't allow you to accept anything as being fully conclusive, especially with respect to ultimate questions. Someone says, well, nobody can know ultimate issues. Well, even that statement itself is a reflection of an assumption of an open system, which as a Christian, I'm going to reject. I reject that assertion, right? I reject that it's impossible for people to know ultimate things, because from within my worldview, there's a God who can reveal ultimate things, right? You might not believe that. You might not hold to that. You might not think I'm correct when I say that, but it makes sense for me to say that within a closed system. Okay. And it makes sense for you to say I can't know ultimate things from an open system. That is consistent, right? So that's all I'm saying. So there's often an inconsistency there. Okay. And it applies a whole bunch of areas. So if you have an open system, I mean, take a look at, the idea of human dignity, right? If someone says, well, we don't need God to believe that humans have dignity and worth, right? I think human beings are worth, what's the word? They have value and so forth, right? In a Christian closed system, human dignity is grounded in the belief that humans are created in the image of God, right? Right, giving every person inherent value and worth from within the Christian perspective. But in an open system where humans are simply the product of random evolutionary processes, if evolution is your explanation and so forth, and everything issues from the womb of chance and so forth, then there's no objective basis for asserting that humans have any more intrinsic worth than any other life form, right? If dignity is not grounded in something beyond the human, then it's merely a social construct, okay? Subject to change or even dismissal, okay? The atheist or the skeptic might argue for human dignity, but their worldview, which denies a transcendent source of value, can't consistently uphold the idea that all humans inherently possess worth, right? And this inconsistency, I think, weakens their arguments and highlights the need for a closed system like Christianity to provide a coherent foundation for the belief in human dignity, okay? You might disagree, that's fine. But from within a Christian perspective, human dignity makes perfect sense. And none of this business of, well, because there is no afterlife, we need to care and value life now. And so you talk as though there's value in the fact that you are finite, but ultimately that's not value in some objective sense, right? That is a subjective opinion as to the value. That's not, when you say I live for my family and my friends and so forth, we can say that, and it is in fact valuable, by the way. Okay. But if there is no purpose, there's no rhyme or reason to life, it's not purposeful in an ultimate sense, right? We've created that for ourselves in a subjective sense. Okay. Now, again, I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying in an open system, you're going to have difficulty affirming objective value and human dignity. You might hold to human dignity and value, but you need to square that with an open system if that's the kind of system that you have. Okay. All right. Okay. So while going through some of these, I think I think it's useful to see the implications of, this open and closed, understanding of reality. Okay. Now, when we engage with other worldviews that also describe themselves as closed systems, right, where not everything is possible because they claim to have, similar reasons and structures as the Christian worldview. For instance, this might be the case with certain theistic worldviews like, Christianity. They assert the existence of a God and they claim to have a coherent, bounded system of beliefs and truths. When we encounter these competing theistic worldviews of closed systems, if you have that flavor of closed systems, we need to engage them from an apologetic standpoint in a manner similar to how we would engage with the atheistic worldview or any worldview that posits an open system. And so the key, the key is to apply what's known as the internal critique, right? This is how we would engage other closed systems that posit some form of deity, okay? And so this involves analyzing worldviews based on their own claim, their own principles, and internal consistency. Okay. And I think that that's an important point. Hello, Dedicated Ghost Archive. I love that name. Dedicated Ghost Archive. Hey, Eli, this is my first stream. I'm tuning in live. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Awesome. Let me get a quick water break. Oh boy, I almost chugged that. I was chug. I was so thirsty there. Woo. All right. So let me continue here. So if a worldview claims to be a closed system, okay, as opposed to the open system, which we can criticize open systems in the way that we've expressed before, our task from an apologetic perspective is going to be to examine that perspective in light of that claim. And so we scrutinize whether it truly functions as a coherent closed system or if it fails to uphold the very principles that it asserts. Okay, so for example, we would look at whether the worldview can consistently account for the nature of truth, things like morality, knowledge within its own framework. That's the internal critique. Does it provide a sufficient basis for rationality and intelligibility, or does it contain internal contradictions and inconsistencies? This is where the internal critique is going to be made. Now, I hear this 1,000 times, and I'm not saying this. And even though I say this, someone's going to say, yeah, that's what you're saying, right? I'm not saying that simply showing an inconsistency in a competing worldview demonstrates that my worldview is correct. That is not the presuppositional argument. Okay, people make, yes, this is live. Agent plays. Agent plays. This is live. Yes, sir. Yeah, or ma'am. I don't know. Sorry. Okay. But people make this critique. I did a critique of Hugh Ross, Dr. Hugh Ross, where he says that presuppositional apologetics is great as a negative approach. It shows how another worldview fails. But if you're going to prove the Christian worldview, you can't use presuppositional apologetics. You need to appeal to something evidential, and that's just false. Okay. We don't believe that when we appeal to evidences, for example, as presuppositionalists, that we're no longer doing presuppositional apologetics. One of the comments in my previous video, someone fallaciously said, if you're using evidence, then you're no longer a presuppositionalist. Don't you even know what a presupposition is? Yada, yada, yada. And right, of course, this person probably, that was the only video they watched. And, they, in their false wittiness, thought that like, oh, wow, I never thought about that before. Okay. So it doesn't, yes, that's right. So atheist says, so you're saying that pointing out an inconsistency automatically demonstrates that your worldview is, see, I know you're kidding and you're laughing, but that's literally the comments I get. and I'm a teacher, so my account, my YouTube account is connected to my watch. So every time I get a comment, I get a little buzz on my watch. And so I'll look down and I'm just like, oh my goodness. So I'll be teaching a class and then I'll see a very cringe comment on a video. And it disrupts my day. I'm like, oh, how can I just said that's not what I was saying. So these are the sorts of things that I deal with. Okay. But yes, that is hilarious. Oh boy. All right. So the process of an internal critique involves testing a worldview by its own standards. Okay. So if a theistic worldview claims to have a God who provides the foundation for all truth and morality, right, we would explore whether this God in question, right, as described, truly fulfills that role, right? Does this God's nature and revelation genuinely account for the necessary preconditions for logic, morality, human experience, all these sorts of things? Or do we find that the worldview ultimately collapses under its own weight because it can't sustain the claims that it makes? Okay, that's the world. That's the critique, right? When someone says, well, wait a minute, you think that your worldview provides the necessary preconditions for intelligibility, but what if someone says, my worldview provides it? See, so anyone could make the claim, as though all we're saying is, yeah, we're just making the claim. Well, anyone can. Can a Muslim use a transcendental argument? Okay, right. Before someone in the comments says, well, what if someone uses this argument? Yes, a Muslim can use a transcendental argument. A Buddhist can use a transcendental argument. An atheist can use a transcendental argument. They can. Transcendental arguments are a thing. Okay. The question is, can they actually make good on the transcendental claim that they're making? Okay. Someone could say, if knowledge is possible, atheism is true. Or if knowledge is possible, Islam is true. Knowledge is possible, therefore Islam is true. Or you can do that. Can you actually pay the bills on that claim? That's the difference. Okay, so it's not a critique on the precept view by simply saying someone else can use the argument. Right. It's not a critique of a view claiming that someone can make a similar argument. Anyone can make arguments. The question is, can they be justified? Okay. And I argue that the Christian worldview can. Okay. That's right, Mr. Atheists out there. Defend your premise. I've gone through this a bajillion times. And again, disagreeing with my defense of premise one of the argument, if knowledge is possible, the Christian worldview is true. You're disagreeing with the premise is not the same as refuting my defense of the premise. Okay. Anyway, thank you. Love you from my open system. Thank you very much. I love you from my closed system as well, because I have an objective standard of love by which to measure, and so on and so forth. So there you go. Alyssa Scott says, appeal to something evidential, and on the other hand, they can't have certainty. That's right. Yes. And this is why Christian open systems are problematic. On the one hand, a Christian will affirm a closed system where they're at church. Okay. And then when they argue with unbelievers, they argue as though they're arguing from an open system. And so the Christian will argue high probability, most likely, reasonable. Ultimately, we can't know, but and that kind of apologetic flows from an open system, even though they might be thinking that they're operating on a closed system. There's the inconsistency there. Okay. All right. So we've covered how to perform, internal critiques and things like that on this channel. I'm not going to, go over that again. But anyway, the Christian worldview not only claims to be a closed system, but also I think demonstrates through careful analysis that it indeed provides those necessary preconditions for understanding reality, truth, morality, and so forth. And this is why, when faced with other worldviews, whether they claim to be a closed system or an open system, we apply this rigorous method of critique to expose their worldview's weaknesses, right, and highlight the unique coherence of the Christian perspective. Okay, and so within the Christian worldview, we can account for truth. If someone says we can't account for truth, okay, let's explore that. Okay, if the Christian worldview is true and there's a God who created everything and defined everything within the Christian worldview, yes, we can account for things that are true because we're in a position to know certain truth, not all truth, certain truths, because God revealed it. You might not agree with that, but from within the system, truth is accounted for. Okay. Knowledge is accounted for within the Christian worldview. Intelligible experience, as all facts have their meaning and coherence within the mind of God, and he reveals his mind to his creatures who are made in his image, who are able to apprehend those truths. Okay. And this is because the Christian worldview is founded on the existence of an omniscient, omnipotent God who knows all things. And so God, in his infinite wisdom, has created human beings in his image, endowing us with the capacity to know and understand aspects of reality because he reveals it to them. There's a great simplicity to that as well. Okay, as the famous song goes, Jesus loves me, this I know because the Bible tells me so. There's a very profound truth there. That knowledge comes from revelation, right? God has revealed things in the Bible, of course, and through natural revelation. We make that distinction in Christian theology between natural and special revelation. Okay. Because we are made in the image of God from within a Christian worldview, we possess purpose and intentionality, right? Qualities that are rooted in the very nature of our maker. And so our ability to comprehend the world around us is not a random accident, right? But it's a reflection of God's purposeful design. Okay. In the Christian worldview, every fact, every element of reality has meaning and context within the mind of God. And these facts are not arbitrary from this perspective. They're defined by God according to his will. He reveals them to us through both general and special revelation, right? The natural world, the heaven declares the glory of God. Special revelation, we have scripture, right? That dual revelation, both external and innate, okay, considering that we're made in the image of God, grounds our ability to understand and make sense of the world. Well, you can say that, Mr. Christian. That doesn't mean it's true. Well, how do you demonstrate that it's true? Well, we demonstrate that it's true twofold. Number one, we know it's true because God's revealed it. How do we demonstrate that God has revealed it? By the impossibility of the contrary. Reject it, and the position cannot account for the preconditions of intelligibility, cannot account for these other things as well. And so we offer from the Christian worldview how we can account for those things. Okay. Now let's see here. Let me see here. FYI, Eli, if you're interested, we could have that conversation about pride and other secular ideas on stream. I'm a newish Christian, and I think it could help others. Yeah, well, we can see. Well, maybe we can exchange through email and talk a little bit about that. Okay. All right. All right. Thank you for that. Let's see here. I don't know what this means. You're asserting that there is some knowing that Christians, that non-Christians cannot. What? I don't know. Why is that not a Gnostic claim? No. Okay. So I don't know exactly what you're saying. So I do apologize. Because you are asserting that there is some knowing that Christians, that non-Christians cannot. I'm not sure what you mean. Okay. I'm saying from within a Christian worldview, I can ground knowledge. From a non-Christian worldview, you can't ground knowledge. But what I'm not saying is that non-Christians don't know anything. I believe non-Christians have knowledge. But that's not because the non-Christian worldview accounts for knowledge. It's because the non-Christian innately borrows from the Christian worldview because he has a knowledge of God. Now, I'm not going to demonstrate that here because that was the topic of a whole nother video. But if that's what you're saying, yeah, I'm not simply saying that I know something that you don't. Yeah, I hope that's not what you think I'm saying. Okay, I'm sorry if I don't understand that. Anything they take for granted. Let me see here. So JVox says, those who take issue with precept do so because it forces them to have to give an account for the many things they take for. That's right. That take for granted that don't comport with their worldview. That's right. Yes. People think like, oh, precept. Oh, they're going to try to question, whether there's an external reality, and they try to make sense. They try to ask all these weird questions about, how do you know you're not a brain in a. Those aren't just like tricks. Okay. Because we're dealing with a difference of worldviews, and the unbeliever disagrees with the Christian assertion that the Christian worldview provides the only foundation for knowledge and intelligibility, right? If you disagree with that, then you implicitly are saying that the Christian worldview is not the only foundation for those things. So you must think there's some other foundation. Okay. That's the disagreement, right? So the Christian gives their reason why they think the Christian worldview is the only worldview that can provide those things. The non-Christian disagrees. And so what happens from the disagreement? You disagree with the Christian account. So now how do you disagree with the Christian account within the context of an argument? You give a counter account. And that's where many non-believers, not all of them, but many, they won't give their non-Christian account. Why? Because they fallaciously think that the nature of our argument is burden shifting. No, it's not. When the Christian says the Christian worldview provides the only foundations for intelligible experience, we welcome that burden, and we try to explain how the Christian worldview does in fact do that. We tried to do that. Okay. Right. We've offered our burden. Maybe we made good on it. Maybe we didn't. Okay. But you don't challenge that assertion from the Christian perspective simply by disagreeing with it. The nature of the Christian claim, the Christian worldview is the only worldview that provides the necessary foundation for intelligibility. Okay. The nature of that claim requires, if you're going to fight against it, requires offering a counterclaim that provides those preconditions. That's not a burden shift. That's the way you interact with the argument because of the nature of the claim that we're talking about. If I say this is the only foundation that we have, and here's why, and you say, nuh-uh, I disagree with your why and your justification, then you don't just get to disagree with it. You have to disagree with it and show that your disagreement is warranted by providing another account. And we often don't get that account because either they'll think fallaciously that that's burden shifting on our part. It's not. Or many unbelievers, not all, have a problem actually providing the foundations of their worldview because their worldview, if you're an atheist, really doesn't account for those foundational things. And that's not just a Christian claim. There are many non-believers who say, yeah, an atheistic perspective does have problems with logical absolutes, the problem of induction, uniformity. This is not just like presuppositional stuff. Okay. So just to clarify that. Okay. Now, all right. So that's a lot going on here. Okay. Now, how does the Christian offer a solid foundation for intelligibility and meaningful interpretation of all things, right? Okay. It does so, the Christian worldview does so, by grounding all facts in the mind of God, okay? In the Christian metaphysical framework, right? Every fact, every element of reality finds its meaning, its context, and coherence in God's eternal knowledge, okay? Because God is omniscient and omnipotent, everything that exists is comprehended and defined within his mind, ensuring that reality is both intelligible and orderly. And so we as human beings, made in his image, are able to meaningfully interpret the world around us precisely because we are created in his image, endowed with the capacity to understand and engage with the world in a way that reflects his rational nature. That's the Christian account, okay? That's the Christian justification from within our worldview, okay? Now, someone asked me, well, can you justify that in reality, not just in your worldview? Okay, think about this. Someone asked me, can I justify my Christian claims in reality and not just in my worldview? What's the problem with that question? It begs the question that the Christian worldview is not reality. Okay, that's just a bad. You could prove that in your Christian worldview, but can you prove it in reality? Well, that assumes that reality is not the way the Christian worldview asserts that it is. All right, and so that question begs the question. Man, this is the kinds of questions I've received in the comments. It's just bad form. Now, of course, someone might reject what I just said and say, well, that doesn't mean it's true, right? If you say, well, God is the necessary precondition, blah, 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 that doesn't mean it's true. Okay. The truth of the Christian worldview, I argue, is demonstrated by the impossibility of the contrary. That's the transcendental argument. I go into more details. I don't just simply assert impossibility of the contrary. People who've seen my stuff, you know, I go more than that. Even if you disagree with whether I'm successful, you know, I'm not simply saying by the impossibility of the contrary and that's it. Okay. So in other words, I would argue that if you reject the Christian framework, right, you're left with a worldview that can't account for the very things that it assumes. Things like logic, morality, intelligibility. I get it. There are atheists who say, I can account for those things. And, you know, I would hear you out if we were in, you know, at a, you know, coffee place together and talking to hear you out. Okay. Now, I know the options that many atheists have, and the options I don't think do it, but hey, let's have the conversation, right? Okay. Now, if you reject the Christian worldview, I would say that the worldview that is the non-Christian worldview cannot account for those things. And so by rejecting the Christian worldview, I would argue, okay, the counterposition can be reduced to absurdity. We can perform a reductio, okay, which I've tried to do in other videos. And when you try to make any intelligible and meaningful statements about facts or reality, right, you will find that your worldview can't consistently support those claims. I know you disagree with that, but that's the nature of the argument, okay? How does that demonstrated? By internal worldview critique. Okay. Now, when someone counters what I say, well, I don't need to borrow from the Christian worldview, right? I can make sense of it. I can make sense of all these things within my own worldview. All right. This is obviously a common claim. No one's going to be like, oh, yeah, well, I guess the Christian worldview is the only world. I understand that. Right. Okay. And I've explained how the Christian worldview provides the necessary preconditions for intelligibility from our perspective. If you disagree, the question then becomes, okay, so then what is the counterclaim? Okay. And we often hear various responses to this challenge, right? One might say, well, I don't have any, you know, someone says, I don't have any presuppositions. So I say, you know, do the presuppositions of your worldview provide the net? I don't have presuppositions, right? I just go on what's obvious. You know, some people appeal to common sense and they start from there. Okay. Some people say those things. Okay. So now think about that. Well, that seems reasonable, right? I don't need these presuppositions and these weird philosophical stuff. I just use common sense. Again, that doesn't answer the question at all either, because what's considered common sense is highly dependent on your worldview. And people don't always agree on what constitutes as common sense, right? You might think the things that I say is not common sense. And when you think, well, this is common sense, I don't think it's common sense. What's common sense is dependent upon your metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical assumptions. Okay. What you consider common sense isn't necessarily true by the impossibility of the contrary necessarily too. You have to argue that. And it doesn't provide the same foundational stability as the Christian worldview, I would argue. Okay. Now, another common approach that I often hear in the comments and the interwebs, okay, and by the way, these aren't things that I hear from sophisticated Christians. These are the things that I hear in like that I read in various comments and things like that. Not in this video. I'm not saying that about anyone here. Okay, but someone might say, well, I just start with what I can see. So they place a great emphasis on the empirical, right? Okay. And this people can come across with like a naive empiricist perspective, right? The idea that, our senses alone provide a reliable foundation for knowledge. Okay. But even that approach, I think, has problems, right? It has it's been heavily criticized, not just by Christians, but by people who don't hold to a naive empiricist position, right? Okay. Think about it. If all knowledge comes through senses, okay, this has been refuted by many people, not just Christians, right? If all knowledge comes through senses, how did you come to know that? You didn't come to know that through your senses, right? So again, that's a self-refuting position. Okay. So no matter which alternative you pursue, now there are many more alternatives. I'm just giving these very easy examples just because these are the sorts of things that I've read in some of the comments, right? There are different, alternatives, but you're ultimately, I would argue, you're going to run into some problems. Okay. The atheist or non-Christian worldview, I think, can't escape the need to borrow from the Christian framework to make sense of reality. And I don't think that that's a bare authority claim. And I've explained in other videos why that's the case. I'm not just making that assertion. Okay. Okay. And when examined carefully, the Christian worldview, I argue, stands as the only consistent and coherent system that provides those preconditions for truth, intelligible experience and these sorts of things. Now, someone might push back. Okay. They might say, come on, man, I just start with reality, right? Reality is reality. We've heard that in various contexts. When in my conversation / debate with Tom Jump some years back, this is the position that he held to. And by the way, I really enjoyed my my conversation with Tom Jump. It's very interesting though, reading the comments. I don't normally read comments when I go on atheist channels, but one comment said, hey, this guy Eli is the nicest presuppositionalist I've ever seen. And then the next comment says, this guy's the most arrogant, blickety blick, right, I've ever seen. It was very interesting to observe. I thought the conversation was nice and respectful the whole time. That was a very odd situation there. But Tom argues like this, right? He says reality is reality. It exists and it doesn't contradict itself. So I've got the logic on my side there, right? Existence exists and existence is not preventing me from not existing at the same time. You get all these kinds of things. Okay. I don't think that works. I think this idea that reality is reality is just it's a tautology, and it's ambiguous, right? It's a statement that repeats itself without providing any real explanatory content, right? It's ambiguous. What do we mean by reality? What is the nature of reality, right? As soon as you start defining what you think reality is, okay? When you say reality is reality, and I ask, well, what do you mean by that? Well, it's existence. Well, what exists? Okay. What is it? The very moment you answer that question, you're diving headfirst into metaphysics, that branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of existence, right? And when you begin to assert your view of reality, the next question then becomes, how do you know? And this question forces you into epistemology, where you now need to explain how you acquired knowledge about reality. And if you're not coming from a perspective that has revelation, then you are stuck in what many have acknowledged as the egocentric predicament. Right? You lack an objective picture of the nature of the world. And so everything you say is speculative at that point, especially if the undergirding foundation of your worldview is an open system. Okay. But here's the catch. If you deny the existence of God, you lack a foundation for knowing metaphysically what's truth about reality, right? Without God, you're thrown back into that open system, right? A worldview that lacks the necessary structure to provide a coherent explanation of existence. So that open system can easily be reduced to absurdity because it cannot consistently account for truth, logic, knowledge, and so forth. Okay. And so it's not as simple as just starting with an ambiguous notion like quote unquote reality, right? What does that even mean, right? Once you begin to explain what reality is, you're forced to make metaphysical commitments, claims about the nature of existence. And here's the problem, right? If you try to develop an epistemology, a theory of knowledge, right, after making metaphysical assumptions, or if you assert metaphysical truths without any epistemological grounding, your entire system of thought is going to be disjointed, and there's problems within the worldview perspective. Okay, all right. Let's see here. Let's see some questions here. Okay, let me see where I left off. Yes, thanks. Yeah, so Agent Play says, where do atheists get their moral standards if there is no God to define what's right? Yep, that's a good point. And this is a bad response. Do you think we can't know murder's wrong unless we have a Bible? That's not what we're talking about either, right? Okay. Now, Agent Plays, you want to be careful. Atheists have all sorts of beliefs. So they might hold to any number of ethical theories, but an ethical theory in an open system is going to be problematic and subjective, right? And a ethical theory in a closed system that is not grounded in revelation, then you have the epistemological problem of not being able to know whether the worldview that you're holding to is in fact an open or a closed system. You couldn't know that if you say it's a closed system. Well, you don't know that because from a finite perspective that lacks revelation, you're not in a position to know the nature of reality. Maybe reality is, on that perspective, pure chance and contingency and randomness. And in that case, if it's an open system, you lack those necessary foundations to have objective moral standards or objective, at logical absolutes and so forth. Okay. Let me see here. Literally, every popular atheist channel answers that question, but those answers don't fit into the chat. I'm not sure what that means. Okay. Okay, so manager. Let me take a cup of water, actually. 1 second. Okay, assume all worldviews do indeed fall into... assume all worldviews do indeed fail to account for intelligibility. Why does that necessitate the Christian worldview can? Why not conclude the Christian worldview also fails? Okay, let's answer that backwards. And I've addressed this in entire videos, so you can check that out. If you look at my channel, I've addressed this in detail. Why not conclude the Christian worldview also fails? Well, I can't conclude the Christian worldview fails because it doesn't. I mean, what is intelligibility? What is truth? What are facts? Given the Christian metaphysic, epistemology, ethic, it accounts for it. Okay. If someone doesn't think it accounts for it, like, okay, explain to me, please help me out. If an all-knowing, omnipotent God who created man in his image, right? He created these. If that God exists, how is it still the case that we can't make sense out of knowledge? I mean, this God in the Christian worldview, there's God who reveals himself. He reveals the nature of the world he's created, so on and so forth. Okay. I'd have to see how the Christian worldview does in fact fail, because when I take the presuppositions of the Christian worldview and the details of its teaching, it does account for those things, right? It accounts for unity and diversity. It accounts for truth. It accounts for objective moral values and duties. It accounts for those things and provides a justification for them. Okay. So I wouldn't conclude the Christian worldview fails because I know the Christian worldview and I know the necessary preconditions for intelligibility, and the Christian worldview does in fact meet those conditions. Okay. Now, if it meets those conditions and the Christian worldview is in fact provides the necessary preconditions for intelligibility, if it in fact provides the necessary transcendental categories, then it logically follows that it is the only worldview that does so. That is what it means to be necessary. So you cannot affirm that a worldview provides necessary conditions, but also affirm the possibility of another worldview also providing those conditions, because then it wouldn't be necessary. Okay. So the Christian worldview does provide those foundations. It provides the necessary preconditions, which makes it follow that it's the only position that can. So I'm not going to throw out the Christian worldview because it actually does provide those conditions. I'd have to be shown that it doesn't. Okay, by the counterclaim. Okay, there you go. All right. Now, assume all worldviews do fail to account for intelligibility. Well, if all worldviews fail to account for intelligibility, then that means the worldview you currently hold to, manager, fails. And so you cannot account for the very intelligibility of the coherence of the sentence you just typed and that I'm sharing on the screen. For the fact that you wrote this sentence presupposes intelligibility. And so if all worldviews fail, then you undercut the intelligibility of your question, right? Now, I believe you believe in intelligibility, but I would argue your worldview can't account for it, whatever your worldview is. If it's a non-Christian worldview, I would argue it can't account for it. Yet here you are making intelligible statements. And the Christian worldview can account for it. And because it's necessary, it must be the only one. You see? So to answer your question, I would not, why not conclude the Christian worldview fails? Because it doesn't fail. Okay. If you think it does fail to account for those things, I'd have to hear the argument. Okay. All right. Thank you for that, manager. I appreciate it. Let's see here. Too far gone. You have to provide a correct internal critique as to why the Christian worldview can't justify it. That's right. That's right. This is 100% correct. You'd have to provide a correct internal critique, right, as to why the Christian worldview can't justify its presuppositions. So the Christian worldview asserts presuppositions that it claims provide the necessary precondition for intelligible experience. How do we know it provides those preconditions? Well, we know what the Christian worldview is. We know what the necessary preconditions are. The Christian worldview, given its metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical picture, answers those questions. If someone disagrees with that, then you have to internally critique it. You can't critique it externally because we're operating from different worldview presuppositions. An external critique, when you throw an external critique, I'm going to reject the presuppositions that undergird your external critique, right? So you're going to have to internal critique, hypothetically grant the truth of Christianity and show on its own terms it falls apart. So you need to actually engage in an accurate internal critique, and it is the job of the Christian to survive the internal critique by answering the questions and the apparent tensions in the Christian worldview. Here's how we answer that from the Christian worldview. Okay. So yes, you're 100% correct. Too far gone. You're not that far gone. You're right on track. That's a good point. Yeah. Very good. Yep. Now this might sound kind of a pietistic, statement here, but I agree. I agree with this. The Christian worldview is founded on the rock. That's right. All other worldviews are founded on sand. I don't say that arrogantly. That's actually an indirect quote that you can make. It's an implication from the words of Jesus, right? Okay. We build our house on the rock. The rock is the firm foundation of God's word. I mean, that sounds religious and, pietistic, but, in a very profound sense, it's very true. The Christian philosophy of life is a rock. It provides foundations. Open systems don't provide foundations by definition. And that's why when they argue from an open system, they're arguing and asserting facts and intelligible experience on a foundation that is open, in terms of which everything is possible. Everything is chance. Everything is flux. Okay. And that is a weak foundation. It's a foundation of sand. Okay. Okay, Dedicated Ghost Archive says, how do you feel about Christians questioning the validity of the passage where the Pharisees bring the adulterous woman? The pericope adulterae. Yes, that is a common textual variant. It is not found in many of the early manuscripts. I'm not 100% familiar with the argumentation, but it is my understanding that most scholars don't see that as original to John. Because of textual critical issues. I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I affirm the reality of textual variants. I also affirm the usefulness of textual variants in affirming the reliability of the biblical text. So I don't have a problem. I don't think textual variance is a problem at all. It actually contributes to the strength of demonstrating the reliability of the biblical text. So I don't have a problem with that textual variant. That's a large textual variant we find in the Gospel of John. You also have another textual variant in the Gospel of Mark, the longer ending there. And I think there's one in First John or something. But yeah, I don't have a problem with that at all. And when Christians question the validity of it, I think that's perfectly fine, because the development of the scriptures and how we find it today, it has a history, and we could examine that history, and we could draw various conclusions, right? We do so carefully, but I think there is good reason from a textual critical perspective to question the fact as to whether the pericope adulterae does in fact belong in the New Testament. There are people who argue differently, and again, textual critical issues are not my expertise, but I think those are valid arguments to be had internally from within the Christian perspective, people trying to examine the text and so forth. So, yeah. All right, let's see here. Let's see. Dedicated Ghost Archive says, I find it troubling that so many believers are so quick to delete a whole passage of the Bible simply because there were some copying inconsistencies. I'm not sure if it, I mean, if you're talking about the adultery, the pericope adultery, I don't think it's simply a copying inconsistency. I think some people find the fact that it's interesting that the pericope adultery is not found in earlier manuscripts. It's interesting. I think it's interesting, and it kind of seems to float around in the textual tradition. So it's an interesting question. I think textual criticism is terribly interesting when you kind of explore the history of the text. But I would say, kind of to highlight what you're saying here, Dedicated Ghost, I find it troubling that so many people are quick to delete whole passages. Well, to say delete the passage already assumes that it belongs in the text. And I think that's something that needs to be argued for and is argued for. And so you have kind of internal discussions on that particular text. Okay. So, but yeah, if someone's so quick to dismiss something without actually studying the details of it, I think that would be a problem. Definitely. Yeah. Let's see here. Right. So Gabriel, is it Teo? Says the precept Christian problem is revelation. There is no justification for revelation. Who says? I mean, that's an assertion, right, Gabriel? You made an assertion. If there's no justification for revelation by definition, then what you're just saying is there's no way to prove revelation from God, and that's the whole debate, isn't it? Right? My argument is that if you reject revelation, you can't prove anything. That's the argument. Right. So, yeah, that's not the problem of precept. It's the strength of precept that we stand on revelation as providing the necessary preconditions for knowledge, truth, intelligible experience, and so forth. So if someone says there's no justification for revelation, I mean, you could say that, but I mean, saying so doesn't make it so, right? Okay. And likewise, when the Christian says, and I have to say this because I know someone will say something. One second. For the Christian, saying so doesn't make it so either. When we say that the Christian worldview is true by the impossibility of the contrary, I think the onus is on us to actually explain why that's the case. And then, of course, the debate and discussion ensues, right? Okay. All right. So, manager says all knowing, including our knowledge of God, begins with sense perceptions. False. I disagree with that, but does not end there. Logic and math are extracted models from existence or reality, not rules imposed upon existence. All knowing, including our knowledge, begins with sense perception. I disagree with that. Who says? Are you saying that we begin as a blank slate? Are you holding to like a Lockean empiricism in terms of which we are blank slates? If you're a truly blank slate, you have no internal innate rational categories to impose and order your sensory experience. I mean, this is a classical critique of empiricism here. Okay, doesn't begin with perception, and that begs the question. Because I would say that revelation is innate. There's an aspect of revelation that is not empirical, and there are aspects of revelation that are. So to say that is just to simply disagree with the revelational epistemology from the outset. Okay. Logic and math are extracted models from the existence or reality. What is existence and what is reality? What is the nature of existence? What is the nature of reality, such that you are in the position to know that logic and math are extracted models, right? No rules imposed upon existence. I mean, we can say that, right? That's your story, quote unquote, your story. How do you know that? How do you know that? And again, that's not like a weird precept thing. Like if you make a metaphysical claim, then that's going to be followed up with an epistemological question, right? If I say God exists, that's a metaphysical claim. And along comes the atheist and says, well, how do you know that? That's a fair epistemological claim. Okay. But it works both ways. You make a metaphysical claim and an epistemological claim. I'm going to ask you epistemological questions, right? All right. Yes. How do you know revelation is true? I know revelation is true because A, God has in fact revealed himself. And B, if you reject the revelation of God, your position is reduced to absurdity. You can't have a foundation for knowledge, logic, intelligible experience. Well, how do you know Christianity provides those things? Well, we went over this a bajillion times, right? In other videos, as well as a little bit in this video. The Christian worldview does, in fact, provide the necessary preconditions for knowledge, intelligible experience, and so on and so forth. Okay. So how do I know revelation is true? How do I justify revelation? The transcendental argument. Okay. And the transcendental argument, sorry, atheist, the transcendental argument is not the Bible's true because the Bible's true. That's not my argument. That never has been my argument, nor has it ever been any presuppositional transcendental argument of anybody who knows anything about the apologetic methodology and the form of argumentation. Okay. So how do I know the revelation is true? By the transcendental argument. Okay. How do I know it's true internally? Well, God has revealed it. I believe the worldview is actually true. God has revealed it to me, and we can argue for it transcendentally. Okay. Let's see here. Boom, boom, boom. Gabriel says, is there a transcendental argument for revelation? Yes, the transcendental argument. when we say the transcendental argument for the truth of the Christian worldview, that argument itself includes revelation. Because in the past, I've said in my video multiple times that the fundamental foundation for the Christian is God and his revelation, right? Without revelation, we lose the epistemological link to know anything about the metaphysical nature of reality, right? The reason why the Christian claims to know reality in some way, in some objective sense, is because God has revealed it. So his revelation is a necessary part of that. Okay. How do I know that God exists and his the fact that God exists is itself revelation. So when I assert the existence of God, I assert that because it's been revealed. How is it revealed? In general and special revelation. How do we justify that? The transcendental argument. Christianity, the metaphysical picture, the epistemological picture, provides the necessary preconditions for intelligibility. And when you reject that, you lose the foundation for intelligible experience, knowledge, and logic, especially if the denial position of the Christian worldview is coming from what we've explained in the beginning of this video, is coming from an open system in terms of which its foundation is contingency, chance, randomness, and so forth. Okay. Thank you for that question, Gabriel. Appreciate it. Let's see here. Yeah. I don't know how to answer this one. If you could live trillion lives, would you be able to tell which one you had the best experience in? Wouldn't that confirm that objectively the best possible subjective life exists? Well, that assumes, I don't understand the question exactly. You'd have to have a standard by which to measure what is the best experience. So you need an objective standard. Okay, that's one. Number two, I don't think you can live trillions of lives if you mean by trillions like some sense of like reincarnation. I don't believe in reincarnation, so I don't think that that's a possibility. I don't think that's an accurate description metaphysically of what happens to human beings. So not sure what you're asking, but I disagree with the presupposition of the question. Okay, so sorry about that. It's a difficult question because I don't really understand what you're asking, but I tried. Okay. Okay. Oh, we answered that already. Okay. Okay. So Sveti, and I can't pronounce the last name. I do apologize. Why does God allow needless suffering of animals? There is, again, when you talk about needless, how do you know suffering is needless? Okay. From within the Christian worldview, everything happens for a specific reason, whether I know the reason or not. So from within a Christian worldview, nothing happens needlessly. Everything has its purpose, regardless if I know what those purposes are. So I don't believe in needless suffering, although I don't claim to know why animals suffer in the way that they do. There's an element of that we can know due to sin. We live in a cursed world and so forth. But from a Christian worldview, in terms of which a God is sovereign and does everything, right? All things work out for the after the counsel of his will. Okay. I don't believe in needless suffering. Needless suffering is not a feature of the Christian worldview. Okay. How do you distinguish revelation from just your brain having false experience? Well, you can't know a brain is having a false experience unless you have an ultimate standard of truth. So you cannot identify falsehood without a standard of truth. That's number one. We distinguish revelation from just your brain in a number of ways. If I can just speak very generically, I just talked about this with my students. For example, someone says, how do you distinguish the voice of God and your own voice in your head? Well, first of all, I don't sound like God, right? God doesn't sound like me. Okay. If I say something to myself and I could say, hey, that's something I would say to myself, it's probably not God. Anything that I get internally in my mind, if it's going to be from God, it needs to be consistent with his word. Now, how do I ultimately distinguish? Well, it's the transcendental argument. Okay. My argument is not, the transcendental argument is not subject to this kind of like, well, it could just be a brain experience. It's an argument. It's a rational argument. Okay. The revelation of God is true by the impossibility of the contrary. We have the objective revelation of God, both in general and special revelation, and it provides the necessary preconditions for intelligible experience. And when it's denied, the opposite worldview is reduced to absurdity. Okay. Now, if you argue, well, all of that's just in your brain, then you're holding to a perspective in terms of which it's impossible to know anything objectively true, because you could always posit that it's something of the brain. That worldview undercuts knowledge of anything, which would undercut the very question itself. Okay. So I don't, I think there is a distinction, because the argument provides the justification. It's not simply just a subjective, thing in the brain. Okay. And I don't think experience of revelation occurs in the brain. Okay. That's not my worldview. My worldview, I believe that man has an immaterial aspect to him. Thinking, on my perspective, does not occur in the brain. It occurs in the mind, the immaterial mind. Now, the mind and the brain are interconnected in very mysterious ways. I don't know exactly how to explain that. Some people might be more equipped to engage that question. I do think that when thinking occurs in the immaterial mind, there is corresponding activity in the brain. So I don't equate the two, but I do think that they are closely related, and that they are separated at death. And that is what death is. From the Christian worldview, death is not a ceasing to exist. Rather, it is a separation of the soul and the body. I get hit by a truck. Everyone goes to my funeral. My body is in the ground, and I go to be with the Lord. That's kind of my metaphysical picture. So I would have issue with that, the way the question's worded there, but those are my thoughts there. Okay. Gabriel goes on to say, isn't personal revelation founded on sand? Personal revelation? What do you mean personal revelation? You mean something that someone just claims, I have a revelation, right? That's not the nature of the Christian revelation. The nature of Christian revelation is that it is public, right? Personal revelation is not something that is characteristic of the biblical perspective. For on the biblical picture, God has revealed himself to everyone. The heavens declares the glory of God. Okay. The revelation that God has provided can be examined objectively. It is not something that just happens in my brain. That's why the Bible often appeals not just to the inner portions of man as we think about God's revelation, but it also appears to the objective reality that we could examine, that we can look at. The heavens declare his glory. It's not simply something that is, personal and not examinable by others. Okay. The mighty Zarlak says, I think it's a foundation of intellectual honesty, not asserting something that is unfalsified. Why can't I understand that sentence? Let me read that again. I think it's a foundation of intellectual honesty, not asserting something that is unfalsified. Okay. You could have worded that differently. I'm going to skip that one because I don't know how to answer it because of the way it's worded. Maybe it's me. I apologize. Sorry about that, Mighty Zarlak. Love the name, by the way. Big Star Wars fan. Let's see here. Right. So Gabriel goes on to say, isn't personal revelation founded on sand, as people can be wrong about their experiences and how they interpret them? Yeah. If you're saying a personal revelation, like no one else has this revelation, yeah, there's no way for me to know if you're having that revelation because it's personal, subjective to you. But that's not the nature of Christian revelation. Christian revelation is public and examinable, so to speak. Okay. So no Christian standing on a biblical basis is going to say, I have this personal revelation that no one else has access to. If someone claims that, there are problems with that biblically. And yes, people can be wrong about their experiences. But to be wrong about your experiences presupposes a standard of rightness, and that you could know the difference between right experience and wrong experiences to judge those experiences. Okay. And the possibility of people misinterpreting their experience does not logically entail that no one can properly interpret their experiences. For the interpretation of experience, okay, can be done when someone is operating upon a correct worldview that provides a context to interpret your personal experiences and the standards of whether those experiences are true or false and so forth. Okay. Right. So Mighty Zarlak says, your fallible mind and asserting it comes from God. Your fallible mind, right? So fallibility is known because there are standards of infallibility, right? And so we have objective standards to measure fallibility, okay? I grant that I am fallible because I know that God is infallible, and I know that I can't reach his standards, right? But he is a standard by which I can make assertions that are infallibly true because the infallible one reveals it, okay? That's it. If the infallible God exists and he infallibly reveals certain truths, not everything, there are things that I could be wrong about, right? But there are things that I would argue I can't be wrong about. And those things I can't be wrong about, I can't be wrong about them because the one who can't be wrong reveals it. Okay? From within the Christian worldview, that's possible. That's what I'm saying from my perspective. Let's see here. Let's see here. Mighty Zarla continues. Do you think the impossibility of the contrary is reasserting the claim God is the necessary precondition for transcendentals? Saying it's necessary already implies the contrary is impossible. Let me see. So do you think the impossibility of the contrary is reasserting the claim that God is necessary? Well, it's not. The impossibility of the contrary is just the outflow of a transcendental argument. It tries to show what a transcendental argument is trying to prove. So if I were to take the logical structure of a transcendental argument, X is the necessary condition for Y, therefore X. That's all we're saying. X is the necessary condition for Y. X, the Christian worldview, is the necessary precondition for some fact Y. Okay, maybe Y is something we all agree on. Maybe Y is the general reliability of our senses. Y is the uniformity of nature. Y is, any fact that we could agree upon. X is the necessary condition for that fact. That's all we're saying. We're not just reasserting God's necessary. We're saying God is necessary. How do we know he's necessary? By the impossibility of the contrary. If you deny the God, then you lose the preconditions. You see? So I don't think it's as simple as you laid it out there. But thank you, Mighty Zarlak. Oh, come on. Come on. Are you trolling me, Mighty Zarlak? Maybe you weren't here from the beginning, but so no, you're saying God is true because you presuppose God is true. No, I'm not saying God is true simply because I presuppose God. I'm saying that I can justify the presupposition. Now, I know people say, you can't justify a presupposition by definition. That's a common misconception. One second. That's a common misconception. You can justify presuppositions via transcendental arguments. Okay, transcendental argument can, in principle, justify a presupposition. Okay, if it's a successful transcendental argument. So no, I'm not simply saying I presuppose God. I presuppose God. That's true, but then I justify that presupposition via transcendental argumentation. Okay. Okay. All right. Dedicated Ghost Archive says, if God upholds his creation, does that mean he upholds the suffering as well? I'm a new Christian. As I said, I just want answers to these hard questions. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So if God upholds his creation, does that mean he upholds suffering as well? Yes, it absolutely does. Now, when you say upholds, it really depends what you mean. But yes, there is no such thing as suffering within the Christian worldview that is purposeless. Okay. God permits suffering because he has sovereign purposes in permitting them. Okay, in whatever instance of suffering. And of course, Jesus Christ himself suffered, and God, the Father and the triune God was sovereign over that process as well, right? Because God accomplishes things through suffering. Okay, amongst them, there are many reasons for suffering, but amongst them is the sanctification of the believer. We become more Christ-like as we work through suffering and difficult times, trusting in God in the process. Okay, that's one of the many reasons. There are other reasons as well. Some of the reasons we don't know. So biblically, I can tell you why God permits suffering, and then there are other aspects of suffering that I'm not sure why God permits this specific instance of suffering. But because the Bible teaches that God is sovereign, he is good, and he has purposes, we know that God has sufficiently good reasons for the suffering that he does in fact permit. And as children of God, we trust him in the midst of suffering. And of course, God suffers alongside us in the sense that he sends Christ. Christ suffers and goes through a horrible death. And, the God-man, Jesus Christ, sympathizes with us mere mortals as we go through this life suffering as well. And so yeah, I would say that God upholds suffering as well. And that is why suffering is never purposeless. And as a new Christian, it is a very encouraging thing to know that when you are suffering, God has good reasons for permitting suffering in our life. And he permits suffering for our good, whether you can see that good or not. We trust that God does in fact have those goods, and we trust in his plans and his purposes through difficult situations. Okay, great question. Excellent. All right. Okay. So I've addressed this already, but we'll do it again. So due to the impossibility of the contrary is a very large claim. I mean, it's a transcendental argument. I mean, transcendental arguments are kinds of arguments. So, I mean, I guess it's a large claim, but okay. All right. That's not a point against it. Right. But he says, due to the impossibility of the contrary is a large claim. How can my worldview or other worldviews being incoherent lend any extra probability towards your worldview being true? Well, first of all, a successful transcendental argument eliminates the probability of my worldview being true. For if a worldview is true by the impossibility of the contrary, it must be true. It's not probably true. The transcendental argument is not a probability argument. As a matter of fact, throughout the history of philosophical argumentation, transcendental arguments are primarily anti-skeptical arguments. They are meant to provide such a certainty that the skeptic cannot deny it. Okay, at least that's the attempt of it. Right. So the nature of a transcendental argument is not a probabilistic argument. Now, when you say due to the impossibility of the contrary is a very large claim, but how can my worldview or other worldviews being incoherent lend any credible probability? Well, what lends to my worldview being true is not merely the insufficiency of your worldview. That's simply an illustration of the fact that when we show that the Christian worldview does in fact provide the necessary preconditions for intelligibility, it provides those necessary conditions. That's what lends to its truth. The person says, but what about this other worldview over here? And to illustrate the truth of the Christian worldview and the insufficiency of another worldview, we can take those other worldviews and show, see, it doesn't work, as an illustration of the main point that we proved over here when we showed that the Christian worldview does in fact provide those necessary preconditions. So I'm not saying that the transcendental argument is credible because other worldviews fail. That's part of it. But I'm saying that the Christian worldview is demonstrated as true because it does in fact provide those necessary preconditions. And if it provides those necessary preconditions, the very definition of necessary is that it has to be the only one, since you can't have two necessaries, if that makes sense. Okay. Great question. Thank you, Mighty Zarlak. Okay. Mighty Zarlak. Sorry, I was responding to something. Oh, okay. That's okay. Yeah, my bad. It's hard because I'm just reading through the text. That's no problem. All right. Let's see here. All right. Pinned comment says, it just seems to me you're conflating logical and ontological priority with actually proving that said logical priority is the case. I don't understand what you're saying. I don't see how I'm conflating anything. I'm saying God is ontologically prior to logic because logic is a reflection of his thinking. Logic is grounded in that which is metaphysically ultimate. From within the Christian worldview, what is metaphysically ultimate is the ontological triune God. There's nothing more fundamental than he. So I'm not conflating it. I have a metaphysical position. The ultimate foundation of reality is the ontological triune God. Logic is a reflection of his thinking. We're created in his image, and therefore we can think logically. Okay, without actually proving. Okay, I'm saying that that's part of the argument, right? So if you do not presuppose the ontological triune God, who provides the metaphysical preconditions for intelligible experience, and you reject his revelation such that we can then have access to that metaphysical reality, then it undercuts any intelligibility, logic, knowledge, and all those other things that I've been talking about ad nauseum. Okay, so no, there's no conflation of logical priority. God is ontologically prior. The laws of logic are grounded in the ontological prior triune God. And that is proven by how? The transcendental argument. Okay, which I went over before. But thank you for that pinned comment. I like that name, pinned comment. That's such an interesting pinned comment. So what's your transcendental argument? Yeah, so we've laid this out a bajillion times on the channel. If this is your first time, that's totally fine. I like to simplify it. So if knowledge is possible, the Christian worldview is true. Knowledge is possible, therefore the Christian worldview is true. No, it's not fallaciously circular. If someone's thinking that, I'm not asserting the Christian worldview is true because the Christian worldview is true. The argument is, if knowledge is possible, the Christian worldview is true. Knowledge is possible, therefore the Christian worldview is true. It's not logically it's not fallaciously circular because the conclusion is not baked into one of the premises. Okay, that's a logically valid argument, even if you disagree with whether it's sound. As to its form, it's perfectly valid. Okay, now. the first premise of the argument, if knowledge is possible, the Christian worldview is true. I would probably, depending on who I'm talking to, if someone's more nuanced, I would actually hash out what I mean by the Christian worldview. I would say more specifically the Christian worldview as understood within the Reformed perspective. There are certain theological and metaphysical aspects of God, understood of God within the Reformed tradition, which is the tradition I hold to. And so when I say the Christian worldview, I mean within that context. I think that's the best flavor of Christianity that can be defended by this argument. But nevertheless, if knowledge is possible, the Christian worldview is true, is simply to assert that the Christian worldview is the necessary precondition for knowledge. Okay. How do you know this? How is the first premise defended? It's defended via a transcendental argument. X is the necessary precondition for Y, therefore X. So the Christian worldview is the necessary precondition for knowledge. We have knowledge, therefore the Christian worldview is true because the Christian worldview is the necessary precondition for knowledge. What must be true in order for there to be knowledge? Well, there has to be truth. The truth has to be accessible, right? And truth with respect to ultimate reality cannot be known independent of a foundation of knowledge. For us, it is the triune God who reveals. So God who creates all things, defines all things, right? Reveals to finite creatures the nature of the world that he created such that we could know it. So from within the Christian worldview, I could have knowledge given Christian presuppositions, okay? There are more details we could hash out, but the Christian worldview, given its metaphysical and epistemological picture, provides that which is necessary to have knowledge. If it provides those necessary preconditions, it follows it's the only worldview that's true, because if it's necessary, it must be the only one. You can't have two necessaries. Now, if someone disagrees with my argument there, they can say, well, wait a minute, that if knowledge is possible, the Christian worldview is true is not true because I have this counterclaim over here from this worldview. I can perfectly account for knowledge, the preconditions, so on and so forth. And of course, then the discussion would ensue from there. Okay, that's in a thumbnail. I've gone over this a bajillion times, but that's okay. Maybe it's your first time here, and that's totally fine. But that's kind of the project I would engage in. Okay, to try and demonstrate the point. Okay. All right. Okay. So, all right. So this is old hat here. So Gabriel says, you cannot use an argument to support foundational revelation, both personal and public. Any arguments for both personal and public would be circular. Maybe a good place to start is what is, I don't know what he wrote. What is revelation? It seems to be feeling a realization something is true. Okay. So there are a bunch of things wrong with this. So you cannot use an argument to support foundational revelation because it would be circular. I gave my transcendental argument to argue for revelation. Can you prove that it's circular? If knowledge is possible, the Christian worldview is true. Knowledge is possible, therefore the Christian worldview is true. What is inherent within the Christian worldview? Yes, revelation. So that is a transcendental argument for revelation implicitly. So I gave an argument there. The conclusion is not fallaciously stated in one of the premises. Here, you need to make the important distinction, Gabriel, between the premise of an argument and the presupposition of the argument. I presuppose the truth of my position, but that presupposition is not fallaciously stated in one of the premises. Okay. And I'm willing to defend the first premise, which is the transcendental premise, via the transcendental argument in the way that I've laid out before. So I just simply disagree when you say I can't argue for these things because it would be circular. It's not fallaciously circular as the structure of my argument's shown, but in a sense, we always presuppose our ultimate foundations, because you cannot justify an ultimate foundation by appealing to something more ultimate than that foundation. But some might argue, but if you can't justify an ultimate foundation by appealing to something more fundamental, then you can't prove your foundation. Yes, you can. How do you prove a foundation without appealing to something more fundamental? A transcendental argument. You show that that foundation is true by the impossibility of the contrary, that if you do not presuppose that, you lose the foundation for proving anything at all. Okay? So that's along the lines of how I would argue. All right. Frank Odom says, will you please explain what transcendental is? I listen to stuff like this probably 10 hours a day and just need to clarify. Dennis Prager, clarity before agreement. All right. Thank you for that, Frank. Let me just grab one cup of water here. Oh, man, I'm running out. This is not good. Okay. So transcendentals, when we're talking about transcendentals, we're talking about what is known as the preconditions for intelligibility. Okay. What does that mean? A precondition of intelligibility or transcendental categories would be that which must be true, pre-condition, what must be the case in order for something else to make sense. So if I were to use an example, if I were on the second floor of a building, what must be true in order for me to be on the second floor of a building? What are the necessary preconditions for me being on the second floor? Well, there must be a first floor, right? Otherwise, if there's not a first floor, then I'm not on the second floor, right? It's kind of just a loose example, right? So transcendentals deal with what must be true in order for something else to be true, okay? Transcendental categories can include, let's say, the laws of logic, okay? The laws of logic are a necessary precondition for intelligibility and knowledge. If logic is not a thing, then you cannot make meaningful propositions like I love coffee or I will go to the beach, since language and its intelligibility presuppose categories of logical principles like the law of identity and so forth. Okay, so transcendentals deal with the necessary preconditions of intelligibility: time and space. Okay, personal identity through time, that's a necessary precondition. If I am not the same person I was before, then I'm going to have problems when I do and say things, right? So identity is a presupposition, a transcendental category. Okay. So you have logic, personal identity through time, time and space, a whole bunch of different transcendental categories. But then we ask the question, what worldview can account for those transcendental categories and bring them together in a meaningful way so as to have this thing we call intelligible experience or knowledge? Okay. What worldview unifies them? I'll tell you one thing: a worldview that doesn't unify them is a worldview that is grounded in an open system of pure chance and randomness. Okay. Because chance and randomness, you have just a bunch of disjointed beads. You need a string to bring the beads together and unify those transcendental categories. The Christian worldview argues that those disjointed beads, those transcendental categories, are unified within the very mind of God. That's why those transcendental categories are necessary. They relate to each other, and they provide a coherent foundation for us finite individuals made in the image of God to make sense out of everything else. Okay? And so those are the preconditions for intelligible experience, and the preconditions for those transcendentals are the ultimate transcendental, the very mind of the triune God himself. How do we know this? He's revealed himself. How do we prove revelation? Through their justification is the transcendental argument. Okay. I hope that makes sense. Hope that makes sense. Sorry if I'm going through it fast. I mean, these questions I've heard them before, which is perfectly fine. But I mean, I love talking about this stuff. So Gabriel says, what is revelation? It seems to be a feeling of realization. Something is true. A feeling of realization. No, revelation is not simply a feeling. I would argue that revelation is an innate knowledge. Okay. Knowledge is not necessarily a feeling. Okay. Revelation is a knowledge. God reveals something to us. He reveals it externally. We look and see, and he reveals. And I think that the very fact that we can think is itself a revelation. So I think revelation of God is innate as well. It is not a feeling of anything, although it might be connected to a realization of certain things, but I wouldn't define it in that way, the way that you've described it there. Right. So Mighty Zarlak says, can I just say reality is the necessary preconditions for transcendental? We have transcendentals, therefore reality, and I'm justified. No, you can't just say that, because what is reality? Reality is reality, right? Is reality an ultimate one? Because if it is, that's going to impact whether you can make sense out of transcendentals. Is reality an ultimate many, loose and disjointed with no transcendent unifiers? That's going to impact whether you can provide the necessary preconditions for those transcendentals. You see, when you say reality is reality, you are starting with what is called an abstract universal. You are asserting a universal category that is abstract and ambiguous. There's no content to the statement reality is reality, because you're not filling in what reality is. You're just asserting this abstract principle you call reality. Now, a lot of people don't like to fill in the categories of what reality is, because that gets you into metaphysics. And if you make metaphysical statements about the nature of reality, then you run roughshod into the epistemological problem of how do you know the nature of reality is what you assert, right? And if you don't have a God within your worldview who reveals, and you're starting from a worldview where there is no God, there is no revelation, how can you know as a finite being the true nature of reality? If you don't know the true nature of reality, then you cannot assert whether it provides the necessary preconditions. Maybe we live in an open system in which chance, randomness is the case, and anything is possible. everything is birthed out of the womb of chance and randomness. On that view, anything would be possible. We live in an irrational reality, whatever reality is, right? And so that's why the Christian does not start with an abstract universal. We start with a concrete universal. There's content to our metaphysic. We don't just say reality is reality. We actually assert what the nature of reality is at the fundamental level. And the fundamental foundation of reality is the triune God, who creates all things, gives meaning to all things, provides a basis via revelation for our epistemology, such that we could explain how we know what we know with respect to the things that God has revealed and how we ought to live our lives, which, by the way, are the three foundations of every worldview: metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Okay. So yeah, that's why you can't simply say reality provides the necessary preconditions, because that's undefined. What does that even mean? What is reality? Well, reality is what's real. Okay, what's real? What's the nature of what is real? Okay, reality is a tautology. You're not giving us any information that we can actually deal with, right? So you're starting with an abstract universal. I would argue starting with a concrete universal would be better. Would be better in terms of providing a foundation for those transcendentals. And that's why, for example, Islam would be in a better position to engage what I'm saying, because they have a closed system. Not everything issues from a foundation of chance, and therefore not everything is quote unquote hypothetically possible on that view. And so they can add content to their metaphysic. Okay, the Muslim can add content to their metaphysic, and then we could actually deal with, well, do these provide the preconditions for these transcendental categories? Okay, and I would argue as a Christian they don't. So just because you add content to that metaphysic doesn't mean it's a true metaphysic. Then we have to now engage in the content, the critique, right? You need to assert your worldview. We give us the details, and we could talk about whether those worldview conditions actually meet the conditions necessary for intelligible experience and so forth. Okay. All right. Good question. Good question. Let's see here. All right. So I have a video on my channel where I try to talk about Plato and why Platonism doesn't work. Okay. So a pinned comment says, okay, so you mentioned the impossibility of the contrary. How is, say, a type of Platonism which posits that preconditions for intelligibility are eternal properties, abstract objects? Yeah. So the problem with Plato is because he lacks revelation, there's no way to connect the ideals to the particulars. I mean, he asserted that there were ideals, but there's no way to bring them together. He doesn't provide a foundation for even moral oughts, for example. So in the Platonic realm, if you have issues like justice and issues of morality, there is no being that imposes the oughtness with respect to how we act upon those. So there is a disconnect between Plato's ideals and his particulars. He affirms them, but how are they in touch with one another? He couldn't answer that question. I'm not going to go through that now. There's a whole video. Just look up Revealed Apologetics, Platonism, or something like that, and I go into the details of that. But the problem for Plato is that he asserts these universal categories, he asserts the particulars, but he has no way, metaphysically speaking, and epistemologically, to link them together. How does the immaterial realm of ideas, how is it in touch with the realm of particularity? Okay, so you can look that up on the video. But thank you so much. All right, let's see here. Pin comment. A while back, you responded to a comment saying that you were trying to get William Lane Craig versus Guillaume Bignon, a friend of mine. He is a philosopher, analytic philosopher, and expert in the area of theistic determinism and Calvinism and stuff like that, to debate compatibilism versus it's actually Molinism, not monism. I'm sure that is a spelling error. That's an accident. Yeah. Any update on that? Yeah. I think that Guillaume had reached out to William Lane Craig, and William Lane Craig respectfully declined an interaction with Bignon. So unfortunately, that's not going to happen. Although that would have been a good one. That would have been a good one. If you're really interested in Bignon and his interaction with Molinism, look on The Gospel Truth. That's Marlon Wilson's channel, where he hosts debates there. And there's a debate between Guillaume Bignon, Calvinist, and oh man, what's his name? Oh my goodness, we had him on my show too. Oh my goodness, what's his name? Is the Molinist guy? Holy cow! Oh, I'm good. This is really bad. Oh, now I have to. Yeah, okay, you're gonna wait up. I have to look up his name. I feel so bad that I don't remember his name. Let's see here. Guillaume versus. Oh my goodness. How did I forget that name? I hope he never watches this because that's embarrassing, as I've had him on the show before. So look up Guillaume Bignon, okay, versus Kirk McGregor. Now, Kirk McGregor is a well-noted Molinist, brilliant guy. They had a great interaction there. I think Guillaume did an excellent job in that debate. Kirk McGregor, I don't think did as well, but he is a brilliant man, a gentleman, and a scholar. It's a really good discussion, but a little bit technical. But if you're interested in that whole like compatibilism and Molinism stuff, highly recommend you check out that video on Marlon Wilson's channel, The Gospel Truth. Type in Guillaume, Guillaume, Bignon, Bignon, and Kirk McGregor, and you'll find it there. Okay. And Guillaume has been on my channel as well, interacting with people like Tim Stratton, Braxton Hunter, and Leighton Flowers. Okay. And we have 2 videos, 2 hours apiece. We go in depth on responding to a lot of the claims from folks who hold to like a libertarian free will perspective. And that's on my channel. Highly recommend those videos. All right. Right. Okay. So Gabriel says, in your syllogism for the transcendental argument, why is there no mention of revelation, both personal and personal and public? Right. So let's go over the syllogism again. So in the syllogism, if knowledge is possible, the Christian worldview is true. Knowledge is possible, therefore the Christian worldview is true. The mention of revelation, both personal and public, is implicit in the first premise. So if knowledge is possible, the Christian worldview is true. What is entailed by the Christian worldview? When you look in the Christian worldview, what do we have? Well, we have revelation that is both general and God reveals things to individuals as well, right? So it's implicit in the first premise by definition of the Christian worldview. You don't have to explicitly state it. It's entailed by the Christian worldview. Okay, so it'd be included. And that's actually, Gabriel, the specific reason why I made the premise the way that it is. Notice I'm not saying if knowledge is possible, God exists. I couch God within a particular context because I'm arguing for a worldview, not just some isolated fact like God or some aspect of Christianity. I'm saying if knowledge is possible, then the whole Christian system is true, since the Christian system is a necessary precondition for knowledge. So it'd be entailed in the first premise. Okay, let's see here. Pinned comment says, not my first time here, but first time interacting or seeing you speak on Tag. I usually watch your videos with Guillaume Free Will, but thanks for answering. No problem. Yeah, okay. I'm sorry I didn't recognize the. Well, now that I think about it, I think I do recognize you. But yeah, when Guillaume is on, it's a lot of fun. He's a really sharp guy. Definitely above my pay grade. I've learned a lot from him. But yeah, I love Guillaume. It's been a while, though, since I've spoken with him. Mighty Zarlek said, okay, let me know what you think. I'll try my best because sometimes I have to like stop and think about it. Let me see. So let me know what you think. Premise 1, the Christian God with its omni properties. Well, first, we do not refer to God in the impersonal. God is a personal being. So we do not refer to the Christian God as an it. That would be impersonal. So you'd probably want to firm that part up. So premise 1, the Christian God leads to a contradiction. Okay, contradictions can exist, therefore the Christian God can't exist. Okay, let me think about that one. Okay, so the Christian God leads to a contradiction. Well, yeah. So good. So I think. I mean, I'm not like the Grand Pumbaa of syllogisms, but as I'm looking, it looks as to its structure valid. And someone could try to say, hey, the Christian God is contradictory because, and in my debate with Eric Murphy as an atheist, I don't remember the show he had, but I was on his show there. You can look up on my channel. It's called A Friendly Dialogue with an Atheist, a Friendly Debate or something like that. Just type in Eli Ayala, Eric Murphy. And he tried to do this by showing that the Trinity was incoherent. And of course, I responded to him. Answering that it's not, right? So you could try to show an internal inconsistency. So if you say if the Christian God, I'm sorry, you don't have it conditional. You say the Christian God leads to a contradiction. Okay. So if that's your assertion, then in order to demonstrate that, you need to do the internal critique. So you have to hypothetically grant the truth of Christian worldview and show that on its own ground, there's some kind of inconsistency within the attributes of God. You might argue, if God is all powerful and all good, he has the power to remove evil. If he's good, he has the desire to remove evil. Evil exists. Therefore, God is not all powerful, or he's not all good, or whatever. You can try to use one of those arguments. And of course, the Christian's going to have their responses. So yeah, that's exact. And this is not something that like I would run away from. Like I keep telling people this, like, if you want to critique the Christian worldview, like do the internal critique. The problem is a lot of the attempts of the internal critique demonstrate, and I'm not saying this about you, Mighty Zarlek, I just in general, what I find is that when people try to engage in the internal critique, they don't actually understand the Christian worldview enough to accurately represent the Christian worldview. So oftentimes they will try the internal critique and on accident misrepresent the Christian worldview, and the Christian's going to be like, well, that's not my position, and so the critique doesn't fall. So that would be the project you would try to do. But then you can push back if you're coming from an atheistic perspective. You have to survive the internal critique as well. So if you cannot provide the necessary preconditions for logic, and you hold to an open system in terms of which anything is possible, then how can you justify the laws of logic in that worldview, the very laws of logic that you use to engage in the internal critique? So there are a lot of things that are coming into play here. That's why we're talking about whole paradigms. Okay. Now, if you were to say the Christian God leads to a contradiction, I'm going to disagree with that premise, right? I think that premise is false. I don't even think so. When you're thinking in terms of logic, I think logic, which is needed to identify a contradiction, doesn't make sense apart from the Christian God, whose attribute sets provide the foundation for the very laws of logic you're using to try to invalidate his coherence, so to speak. So I would say that the premise one is false. And my good friend there, Matt Yester, says premise one is false. Yes, I would agree. Premise one is false. Okay. All right. Mighty Zarlak there. By the way, thank you for your answers and being civil while answering. We may disagree, but I like your style of engagement, being open. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate that, Mighty Zarlak. And I appreciate your questions too, keeping me on my toes as I'm trying to answer off the cuff. So I appreciate your comments, appreciate your question. Let me see here. Also, you must exist. Is that a precondition of you being on the third floor or the second floor? Yes, that's true. A necessary precondition for me being on the second floor. I said the second floor. I suppose you can do the third floor as well. The necessary precondition of being on the second floor is that a first floor exists. And another necessary precondition is that I exist to be on the second floor. So that's true. There are multiple necessary preconditions. Okay. So yes, very good. Okay, Mighty Zarlak says, Matt. Oh, so that's Matt to Matt. Yes, he says, sure, it's on me to show the contradiction. Thank you, Mighty Zarlak. I appreciate this. Okay, you have no idea how much I appreciate this. Okay, because you get it, Mighty Zarlak, and I'm not being sarcastic at all. He says, sure, it's on me to show the contradiction. Mighty Zarlak now shows that he understands that when we make the transcendental argument, we offer our explanation. You might disagree, but we offer the argument. And so now when someone says, but I think there's a contradiction in your understanding of God, it's on me to then now provide that contradiction. So it's not an issue of simply disagreeing with the perspective. You actually have to argue for it. So I appreciate that, Mighty Zarlak. He says he uses the Epicurean paradox to support premise one. Okay, so again, we would obviously disagree there, but that would be one of the ways you would try to engage. And so I do appreciate that one. Okay, let's see here. Let's see. So Jay says, how do you respond to someone who questions the biblical author's experiences? In other words, how can we differentiate truth and falsity? How do we know God truly spoke? Is experience reliable? Yeah, so all of these are going to provide, all of these are going to require necessary preconditions, right? So you say, how do you respond to someone's questions about the biblical author's experiences? In other words, how can we differentiate truth from falsity? Yeah, that's a great question. If someone is raising this objection from the foundation of a worldview that cannot itself differentiate from truth and falsity, then the very objection doesn't make sense. You see, the fact that someone says, well, how do you know their experiences were true? That question presupposes a way to distinguish what's true and false. And if that worldview is from an open system, as we discussed, where technically everything's possible, then you don't have a foundation. If you have a closed system and it's not the Christian system, we're going to offer a way of critique as well. We're going to challenge your epistemology and so forth. Okay. And this is why we argue from worldview. and not just individual isolated points. Someone said, well, how do you know so-and-so had this experience and he could, well, I'm not going to just address your question directly because it really is a presuppositional issue, right? If you say, how do I know something's true or false? That presupposes a theory of true and false, right? And so I want you to justify that because I don't agree with your ability to then ask this question from a foundation that's intelligible, right? So I would attack the foundations of the question, not simply address it directly, because in addressing it directly, the person would unfortunately allow certain presuppositions to stand when those are the very things that we need to be challenging. Okay. Let's see here. Matt Yester. Hey, Matt, how's it going? He says, every inference and act of predication presupposes the existence and absolute personal harmony of unity and diversity within the triune God. Yeah, so this deals with unity and diversity, which is another necessary precondition for intelligibility and knowledge. So if you want to have intelligible experience, you need to have some way of accounting for how unity and diversity are brought together. Okay, this was the problem in pre-Socratic philosophy and all throughout the history of philosophy. How do we unify the particulars of human experience, right? You have this issue of universals and particulars, right? There are people who are nominalists who reject universal categories, and that undercuts the preconditions of intelligibility, I would argue. And so you need universal categories. How do you bring unity and diversity together from the Christian worldview? You might not agree with the Christian worldview. You might say the Christian worldview is false, but guess what? The Christian worldview, interestingly enough, not trying to answer this philosophical question, we posit a God who is triune. There is one God who exists as three persons. Within the very nature of God, you have unity in his essence and plurality in his persons, being equally ultimate. God as the ontological foundation, who is in his nature, both one and many, provides the context and meaningfulness of the one and many that we experience in our human experience of particulars and universal categories, right? Matt Yester goes on to say that the denials that the Trinity exists are acts of predication. Conclusion, the triune God exists. So let's get this up here. So premise one, every inference and act of predication presupposes the existence and absolute personal harmony of unity and diversity within the triune God. Two, denials that the Trinity exists are acts of predication. That's true. You need to predicate in order to deny it. And then the conclusion, therefore, the triune God exists. Okay, premise one, every instance and act of predication presupposes the existence of absolute personal harmony of unity and diversity. How do you demonstrate this? Well, you can point out unity and diversity and show how they are required to be made sense of in order to have meaningful predication and so forth. That can be done quite easily. You deny the Trinity, you have to predicate. And so the conclusion, the triune God exists, unless you have another way to account for unity and diversity, which is the foundation of predication. You're going to have to give your counter worldview claim, and then it's going to be your fundamental foundation versus the Trinity, which is the Christian foundation. And of course, the Christian welcomes that, since they believe the Christian worldview, the triune God, answers these fundamental questions in the way other worldviews do not. Okay. Thank you for that, Matt. I love that. Good stuff. Frank Odom says, wow, I haven't heard this since like the 90s. Boom shakalaka. Okay. I get it. Thank you, Eli. I've recently picked up Always Ready by Bahnsen. Awesome. Excellent. That's a great starter. I always tell people if you're going to read Bahnsen, that's the first one to go to. That is an excellent, excellent book. All right. Let's see here. What original thought do you bring to the subject? I say that nicely and unloaded. Well, I don't claim to be an original, right? I'm not making this up. I stand on people who have gone before and fleshed out these ideas. I suppose my unique contribution, as I understand it, all right, and I'm not saying I'm anyone of importance, is that I have seen years ago and even today that those who hold presuppositional perspective tend to get a bad rap because of how they engage. And so one of the things that I've tried to do is to engage with presuppositionals, talk about those foundations, but do it in a way that is different than the negative picture that is often seen out there. That, coupled with my attempt, whether I succeed or not, is to bridge the gap between the scholars who talk too high that we can't really understand and the average person. I try to find a middle. I'm not going super simplistic where, I simply say, by what standard, right? But I'm not talking so highfalutin that, I'm up here with peer reviewed paper. Like, I'm not a scholar, right? I'm not a scholar. I'm a regular dude. I got my theology background. I have a Master of Arts in Theological Studies. I have a Master of Divinity with a theological focus. I took one semester of apologetics in my entire time in seminary. Most of my apologetics is, I'm learned. I'm an auto. What do you say that? An autodidactic. I don't know if that's the right word. I learn because I've listened, I've talked, these sorts of things. So I'm not a scholar. So I try. My contribution really has tried to be the bridge between the sophisticated people up here, the average person that's somewhere in the middle, where it goes beyond simplistic, but not so far where it's academic and impossible to understand. Have I succeeded in that? I don't know. I mean, I'm trying, right? Hopefully, when people hear me, even when they disagree, they say, well, at least he's not making these like simplistic claims that we often hear. I disagree with them, but yeah, I can kind of see where he's coming from. And, he's kind of giving some more, putting more flesh on some of the claims that presuppositionalists make. If I've accomplished that, then I'm happy with that. With respect to originality, like, no, I didn't invent the transcendental argument. I didn't invent, presuppositionalism or anything like that. So I don't claim to be original. Now, if someone identifies something that I've said that is original, then cool. I haven't done this with the intention of trying to be original, but I suppose maybe I've had an original thought somewhere. So, okay, that's a fun question. Okay, let's see here. Let's see. Eli, I like you, but I don't understand revelation is a knowing. I don't know what that means. I like you, but thank you for liking me. Thank you, Gary. I appreciate it, Gary. Thank you. But I don't understand revelation is a knowing. Yeah. So, okay. I don't understand. I'm not sure what you're saying. But when you know something, okay, let me put it this way. If the Christian worldview is true, God created all things. And the things that he creates is revelatory of him as the creator. And God created you. He created your mind. He created your conscious moments. When you are conscious of something, that itself is a creation of God and hence is revelatory of God. And so knowing is obviously, it's a process. You come to know things, but the very process itself, because it's created, is itself a revelation, since everything in creation, both external and innate, is revelatory of God. Okay. Does everyone acknowledge that? Is everyone fully aware of that in a fully orbed sense? Not necessarily. We've talked about in previous videos the issue of the role of sin and how we suppress the truth and unrighteousness. Also, people are in some instances self-deceived. I explained in another video that the claim that some people are self-deceived is not a bare assertion. We talked about how we can give evidence for the fact that there is some kind of self-deception with respect to the knowledge of God, and we kind of can talk ourselves out of these sorts of things. I went into great detail in a previous video that I'm not going to revisit here. But yeah, so I would say revelation, knowing is revelation in the sense that I've described there. So the knowing process, your waking moments, your conscious moments are created by God, because God created your mind, created you. And in that sense, everything that is created is revelatory. Okay. So sorry if that doesn't answer your question. I tried, but thanks. I like you too, Gabriel. I appreciate it. Let me take another drink of water. Let me tell you something. I went live thinking I was only going to go for an hour. We're at 2 hours and 23 minutes, and I'm actually doing okay. So we're going to stay on for a little bit until I completely lose my voice. Holy cow. All right. There we go. He's answered every question without me. Let's see. Okay. Right. So Too Far Gone says, how would you respond to those who claim the church, the Catholic or Orthodox, gave us the canon of scripture? Yeah. So this is a good question. So you do have not so much Catholics, but like some Eastern Orthodox folks will try to use kind of a form of presuppositionalism in their argumentation. So from within the Reformed perspective, I hold to a revelational epistemology. And it is grounded in God's revelation, both general and special. Specifically, we place a great emphasis on God's revelation in his word. Eastern Orthodox presuppositionalists tend to use what is known in some circles as an ecclesiastical, I'll pronounce that correctly, epistemology. That knowledge is grounded in the church, and the church provides the foundations necessary for the preconditions, because it's the church that gives us the Bible, which puts forth the worldview that provides all those preconditions. Okay, and I would argue by challenging the authority of the church. And how do you do that? You can do it in two ways, as I understand it. Challenging the church authority, you can engage in internal critique of the particular system, Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, and you could offer a counterpoint against the ecclesiastical authority and its epistemological status that it holds within those perspectives. How do you do that? Well, one of the ways you can positively do that is defend the principle of sola scriptura. If you defend the principle of sola scriptura, that actually undermines the validity, if you do it successfully, it undermines the validity of the ecclesiastical authority perspective from the other side. So you could defend sola scriptura in a positive sense, and you could internally critique the other worldview in kind of the negative sense, internal critique. So that's how I would go about it. Okay. Now, obviously, that's a big question. You know, you'd have to be able to defend sola scriptura and all that kind of stuff. And yes, if you don't hold to sola scriptura, I already know the things you're going to say. Well, where in the Bible does it say that? We have responses to that, and I think, and you might disagree. I think that there are powerful defenses of sola scriptura, and I think there are good internal critiques of Roman Catholicism and so forth. But that's not the nature of this specific stream. But there you go. Those are my thoughts there. Okay. I don't know if there's an answer to someone else. Tim Stratton. Yeah, Tim Stratton's a friend of mine. He's been on the show before, actually, a while back. Okay, a few times, I think. But yeah, I like Tim Stratton. Cool guy. Let's see here. Okay, so pin comment says, Kirk McGregor. I'm sure Bignon demolished Kirk. I think Bignon did a fantastic job. And Kirk is a super nice guy. Yes, he is. He is a super nice guy. I love Kirk McGregor. And no offense to him, but he is no philosopher, more so a historian. Well, I mean, he does have a knowledge of history, of church history and things like that, history of theology and things like that. But I wouldn't be so quick to say that. With respect to the philosophy of Molinism, I think he is an outstanding proponent of Molinism. When I was a Molinist, I was deeply impacted by Kirk McGregor, and we had some personal correspondence where he helped me understand a lot of my questions that I had concerning Molinism. Now, ultimately, I came to reject Molinism. If you guys know anything about me, I'm a Calvinist, a 5-point Calvinist. But I used to be a Molinist, and Kirk McGregor was someone that I learned a lot from. But yeah, he's a historian as well, and he's also got a book on theology. One second, I think I have one here. Here we go. This is a book by Kirk McGregor called Contemporary Theology. So yeah, he's a historian. He's also a theologian. And in terms of at least philosophy, I mean, what I know about him, I only know him through the Molinism stuff, but he has a pretty solid grasp on the ins and outs of Molinism as well. Okay. But in my opinion, I think Guillaume did a fantastic job in his debate with him. Very respectful, very high, quality philosophical discourse. I thought it was excellent. Highly recommend folks check that out. All right, let's see here. Oh my goodness, I came here on accident and there's so many questions. I'm so happy. I'm so good. People are listening in, and I enjoy this kind of stuff. So thank you for listening in. Really appreciate it. Let's see here. Jay says, what is the best way to find fellow believers to discuss and learn from? It's not always easy to find people in the church who like to engage in more technical discussions. Testing. All right, good. Yeah, that is a challenge. That's a challenge that I face. The church that I go to, there's not many people that like to talk about the stuff that I'm talking. There's some. So that's good. I go to a fairly large church, so we have like a small group, and there are some guys there that like to talk about this stuff. So I am blessed in that regard. Love those guys. But yeah, talk to people. in your church. Feel it out, see if people are interested. And if they're not, perhaps you can teach something. It's like, hey, maybe you can do something to encourage people to get interested, right? Say, hey, I want to lead a Bible study, or I want to lead a class on apologetics. Maybe you can kind of get apologetics into your church, and maybe the interest will, you'll find some interest there. Otherwise, if you can't find anyone in your close proximity, I really appreciate the online community, right? Most of my theology and apologetic and philosophical friends are people that I've had on the show, or people I've reached out to and talked to personally. And I can talk about apologetics with them and theology, and we have a really good friendship. I'm friends with people that I've never even met face to face, that our interactions have only been over the phone. And I consider them close friends. We talk about stuff all the time. I'll give you it's some of my personal friends, and I happen to meet in person, but not a lot. I've only met a few times because of traveling and stuff. So Braxton Hunter of Trinity Radio, not a Calvinist. He's a Molinist, right? Not a presuppositionalist. He's a classicalist, yet I consider him a very good friend of mine. We've had countless conversations, and he is just such a good friend. Eric Hernandez. If you guys know who Eric Hernandez is, he often debates the topic of the soul. I haven't talked to Eric in a while, but when we talk, I mean, we've spoken over the years for quite a bit. We've even shared the platform when we spoke at an event at Texas A&M International University, where we, for the first time, met in person. We stayed up all night talking about presuppositionalism and, a whole bunch of other topics. It was awesome, but we've maintained relationship over the phone. So the online community has been really has been really good. And so there are different ways that you can do that. Get on a good Facebook page where you can reach out to people and learn things like this. And you can like private message people and maybe have a video chat. It's like, hey man, I don't know other people who like this stuff. Would you mind kind of talking with me a little bit? And you could make friends that way and have good community that way. So that's what's been helpful to me. Okay, I hope that's helpful to you. A friend is trying to use traditional apologetics to his wife. I'm helping him to switch to presuppositional. Well, here's the thing. Apologetics doesn't work with your wife. When you point out a fallacy, it doesn't work. You don't want to go that route. I'm just kidding. Well, cool, man. Yeah, there you go. I think not only do I think the presuppositional approach is the best approach, I think it is a very, not only is it a biblical approach, I think it is the most effective approach. Granted, you're going to have people who are not going to listen. That happens with anything, right? But I think the presuppositional approach is the way to go. So yeah, right on, man. Let's see here. Okay, so 2-minute theology says, what question should he ask? A friend is trying to use traditional apologetics to his wife. I am helping him switch to presuppositional. And then you say, what question should he ask to uncover her worldview? Yeah, that's a good question. So remember, think in terms of, when I think in terms of worldview, a 2-minute theology, that this is helpful because we can kind of get confused with thinking about a lot of different things. I look for 3 things, okay? So every worldview is made up of metaphysics. Everyone has a theory of knowledge. Epistemology, everyone has I'm sorry, I got that mixed up. Everyone has a metaphysic, a theory of reality. Everyone has an epistemology, a theory of knowledge. And everyone has an ethic, a theory of how we ought to live our lives. So the questions you want to ask will be questions that will expose your wife's theory of what is real. Okay. A good way to show an internal tension is to ask questions that expose the theory of reality, and then ask questions to expose the theory of ethics and show a tension. So for example, if a person's metaphysic is, I don't believe that God exists, then that's going to affect the ethic. So when the wife says, hey, honey, you did this to me and I think that was wrong. You see, there's the ethical principle, but notice that is in conflict with the metaphysical perspective that God does not exist, right? Now, I don't expect for you to do that in your relationship, but in conversation, bring that out. Hey, well, if you don't believe in God, right, think about this. Do you live consistently with that when you say, I've done something wrong? Have I done something wrong? By what standard have I done something wrong? Show the tension, right? So ask questions to expose. Now, again, sometimes you don't even have to ask questions to expose the worldview. All you need to do is simply listen to what the person is saying. Well, I don't think God exists. That's a metaphysical claim. Well, I'm not sure God exists. That's an epistemological claim that has metaphysical presuppositions to it, right? Or maybe you're discussing some like moral issues, right? It's going to have an ethical theory embedded in that. Okay, so you don't always have to ask questions. Sometimes just hearing the person out, they will give you enough information to work with in terms of then asking questions about those worldview foundations. Okay, hope that makes sense. Let's see here. Yeah, so Matt Yester, I think he's interacting with someone else, but he says Epicurean paradox equals problem of evil argument, which has been demonstrated fallacious. Yep, problem of evil argument comes in different flavors, as I'm sure Matt knows, and but you have the probabilistic problems of evil, which I think have easy answers to them. At least from a logical perspective. I mean, emotionally, I think it can be difficult responding to some problem of evil arguments. Logical problems of evil, I think, are kind of old hat, and not a lot of people are putting forth logical problems. I think, and this doesn't make it true, but I think on the philosophical scene, logical problems of evil are a dying breed of problem of evil arguments. Okay. Now, if someone still thinks that a logical problem of evil argument holds, I mean, they can hold to it and they can argue it, but I don't think that those arguments do well. Okay. I think there are responses to them. Okay. Let's see here. Yeah, so Mighty Zarlek says, Matt Yester, not really. The Epicurean paradox shows how the trilemma of the three omni properties together can exist. I'd like to see maybe Mighty Zarlek, you could just in like thumbnail sketch. Why don't you type that out, right? What are the three omni properties and how do you think they can exist together? Maybe you can like jot them down real quick and I'll try my best to kind of share my thoughts, okay, if I see it here. Let's see here. Wesley Dickens says, what's a book on apologetics you thought at the time you read it was great, but now you would tell others to, to not waste their time? Now, that's a really hard question because I have read apologetic books from like the classical and evidential perspective, and that while I don't agree with them now, they still have value. I think there's still good things to learn from classicalists and evidentialists and stuff like that. But a waste of time? I'm not sure off the top of my head. I'd have to think about that, Wesley. Yeah, that's a good question. If I think about it before the stream is over, I'll point it out and say, okay, here. But that's hard. I've thought very hard about the books that I've purchased in the past. I haven't read all of these in its entirety, but I like them, even the ones that I don't fully agree with. I think they all have some good nuggets. So I think they're not a waste of time. Anyway, let's see here. Let's see. Okay, I responded to that one. Let's see here. Sorry if I skip anything. I'm not meaning to. I have to plow through a lot of the comments here. Let me see. Oh, wow. Well, thank you for that. Humbled Clay says, Eli, I hope you take this in the manner it's meant. You are the closest thing we have to a modern day Greg Bonson. Well, I'm not sure that's true, but I very much appreciate that. That is a very flattering comment. So thank you very much, Humbled Clay. I'm humbled. I'm humbled by your comment there. Thank you so much. Yeah, I've learned the most from Greg Bonson. So a lot of people think like, I have the books, right? I mean, I've read the books. I have Bonson's books, but most of what I've learned has been primarily through his lectures. And so I am greatly indebted to the teaching of Greg Bonson. And that's a great compliment. I don't think, knowing myself and then knowing Greg Bonson, I don't think that's that's as true as it sounds, but I do appreciate that, and I greatly thank you very much. All right, let's see here. Okay, just going through here. We're a bunch of dorks geeking out on a Friday night on a theological Facebook page. Why not? This is cool. It's fun. Okay, Truth Defenders, Shalom, back to you. Okay. So Gabriel says, if you accept self-deception is real, doesn't that undercut revelation, the knowing? No, it doesn't undercut. Self-deception is real, but self-deception only makes sense within the backdrop of truth. And so I have a worldview in which there is a standard of truth. Self-deception can be a judgment of God, but that is not the normative way that God functions, right? God is a truthful God. He can give someone over so that they fall into self-deception as a judgment. But God is not arbitrary, in which, he's always deceiving and we can't know the difference. But God is the foundation for truth, and he creates the standard by which we could identify and make sense out of the very concept of self-deception. Revelation from God is true by the impossibility of the contrary. If it's true by the impossibility of the contrary, then we can't be wrong about it. If we can't be wrong about it, then that's one thing that we can't be deceived about. Okay. So I don't think that would work either. But thank you. I do appreciate that. Sorry for my quick response there. We're keeping poor Eli up past his bed. How old do you think? I'm not an old man, for crying out loud. Listen, Mighty Zarlak. Eli's an old man and needs to get some rest. It's a Friday night. What the heck? Okay. Jeez Louise. Okay. I don't have a curfew. All right. Imagine I get a phone call from my wife. You're up late and you're making noise. And my daughter's room is on the other side. So if I talk really loud, maybe I'll be told to go back to go to bed or something. Let's see here. Oh, there he is. I was waiting. Where have you been, Nick Jones? Thank you. So, the pitiful charlatan is back on to exploit the simple-minded Christians for money. Okay. Get those super chat donations. Sell those courses, you charlatan. Well, thank you. I will try to sell my courses, and I always appreciate a super chat. So thank you, Nick Jones, for the free advertisement. All right. Let's see here. I think Nick is a bot. I mean, he just does the same things all the time. He might just be a bot. Let me see here. Let's see. Oh, come on, Nick. Little Eli, who only tries to justify his God. That's not how you spell God, Nick. It's G-O-D, not G-A-W-D. Okay. In his own fantasy view of the world, because he knows he can't justify it in reality. Okay. There you go. You should check the spelling there. All right. Let's see here. Yeah, it would be better if you give an argument. Yep. Let's see here. Yeah, that's drama. Yeah. Give me that money, people, because, that's what I'm here for. I'm here to make that money. Make that money. All right. Okay. Well, that's it. I'm all the way at the bottom. Okay. And I don't see any more questions. Okay. So we're at 2 hours and 42 minutes. Okay. I think this is a good time to, by the way, thank you, Mighty Zarlak, and everyone else for your questions. I do appreciate it. I'm going to close out here since it's been a pretty long time, almost on 3 hours. This is the longest I've done in a while. But thank you, Nick Jones, for reminding me. If you like the channel and you like the comment, please give this video a like and subscribe if you haven't subscribed. And if you're interested in supporting Revealed Apologetics, accept super chats. And I also sell apologetics courses on Revealed Apologetics. Thank you, Nick, for reminding me of that. I almost forgot because we got to make that money. We got to make that bling bling so that I could ride in my Lamborghini to work as I teach middle school students at a Christian private school. Okay. All right. I'm being a little saucy, but anyway, thank you so much, guys, for listening in. I really appreciate it. Until next time, guys, take care and God bless. Bye-bye. Oh, look at that. Oh, listen, I could think, I think it's Alcuin. I think it's the Alcuin Project or Alcuin Project. I could thank Alcuin Project for this $10 super chat, but really I should thank Nick Jones because it was Nick Jones who reminded me that I'm in this for the super chats. That's right. My whole life is geared towards making that dough. So thank you, Nick. And then thank you, Alcuin Project, for your $10. Your $10. What do you think the worldview of Gen Z Christians will be in the next few years if they keep focusing on higher level theology instead of scripture? It's just a trend I'm starting to notice. Okay, so before we close out, I'll try to answer this question as best I can. When you say they keep focusing on higher level theology instead of scripture, so I'm seeing a false, dichotomy here, right? So higher level theology could still be grounded in scripture. So I'm not sure specifically, if high level theology, it's not necessarily in, are you talking about more like philosophical stuff? I do think that there's a threat of focusing too much on speculative philosophy over against the teaching of scripture, if that's what you mean. And if that's the case, I think that can be problematic. I think when people rely too much on philosophy, they don't take seriously enough the scriptures. I remember, from my perspective, I think that your high level theology must flow from the Bible. Okay. And the Bible, in its explicit assertions and implicit teaching, set the guidelines for what we are allowed to speculate on with respect to our speculative higher level theology and philosophy. But I don't think higher level theology is necessarily in conflict with the scripture. It just depends on specifically, specifically what you're talking about. Okay. So anyway, I think that is it. To be fair, it's 2 hours and 45 minutes. I think it's a good time to stop. Alcuin Project, thank you so much for your super chat. I do appreciate it. And thank you so much, guys, for listening in. I appreciate you all. And yes, even Nick Jones. Nick Jones, I don't hate you. I'm not angry at you. I understand that you don't hold to my beliefs and you don't accept my answers, and that's okay with me. I'm going to be here. I'm going to speak the truth. I believe the Christian worldview is true, and I'm doing this because I want to serve my Lord. So don't hate you. You are free. This is a free country. You can type away and disagree as much as you want. That's all right with me. So thank you, Nick Jones. Thank you, everyone else. Until next time, take care. God bless. Bye-bye.